The Lady of the Estate, Darya Saltykova, and the Private Power of Serfdom. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Author's note: evidence, translation, and ethical method. This manuscript has been written with an intentionally conservative approach to evidence. Saltykova's notoriety has produced an unusually large afterlife of retellings, summaries, and moralist narratives, many of which repeat one another without making their source base visible. That repetition can create the illusion of certainty. It can also carry errors forward for generations. For that reason, this book distinguishes between three kinds of material. 1. Procedural and institutional facts. These include the broad contours of the case as it appears consistently across historical summaries: petitions, arrest, investigation, sentencing, public humiliation, and lifelong confinement. These are the most stable elements of the story and are treated as the spine of the narrative. 2. Details that recur but are mediated. These include victim counts beyond the convicted number, specific wording attributed to signs or proclamations, and descriptions of conditions of confinement. Such details appear frequently, but they are often transmitted through later case literature rather than directly through accessible primary records. In this manuscript they are handled cautiously, presented as reported or commonly described, rather than as absolute. 3. Dramatic scenes and interior claims. These include vivid depictions of Saltykova's moods, private conversations, motives, and daily life during confinement. These claims are common in popular retellings and are often delivered with certainty. They are also rarely traceable to primary documentation. This manuscript avoids them. Where the archive is silent, the manuscript remains silent. The same caution applies to moral interpretation. This book does not minimize harm. It also does not use harm as spectacle. It does not attempt to entertain through brutality, and it does not provide graphic detail where it adds no historical clarity. The focus remains on structure: how a state's sovereignty operated, why petitioning was risky, how intervention became politically possible, and how punishment served state legitimacy as well as moral condemnation. On translation. Saltykova's story circulates across languages. Names vary in spelling. Titles shift. Terms used to describe serfs, punishment, and authority carry cultural meanings that do not translate cleanly. When English-language accounts employ moralistic or gendered language, monster, madwoman, she-devil, this manuscript does not adopt those terms as neutral descriptors. They are treated as part of the story's cultural afterlife, not as evidence of inner truth. On victim counts. Victim numbers are among the most frequently repeated and most inconsistently handled elements of the case. Many retellings cite a high number of alleged deaths, while also noting a smaller convicted number. This manuscript does not collapse these categories. It treats legal proof and suspected scope as distinct, and it avoids presenting inflations as established fact. On what this book is, and is not. This is not a Gothic portrait. It is not a psychobiography. It is not a catalogue of suffering. It is a study of private authority and the risks it creates when protected by law and distance. It takes seriously the limits of the record and refuses to fill silence with invention. The aim is not to make the past feel like modern true crime, but to show how the past functioned on its own terms, and why those terms produced vulnerability for the powerless. A publication edition would ideally include a chronology of key dates and procedural steps, a claims table separating primary, mediated, and speculative material, a fully standardized bibliography, for example, Chicago Notes and Bibliography, and, where possible, archival references to the investigation record and imperial documentation. For the purposes of this working manuscript, the book remains ethically restrained and transparent about uncertainty. Where the record is strong, it is used. Where it is thin, it is acknowledged. Where later retellings attempt to sell certainty, the manuscript resists. That resistance is part of the method. It is also, in cases like this, part of the responsibility. Preface. This book begins with a woman who possessed almost unlimited authority inside her own domain, and with a system that made that authority both ordinary and invisible. Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova was not marginal. She was not poor, transient, or socially precarious. She was born into the Russian nobility, married into one of its most powerful families, and inherited estates that placed hundreds of lives under her direct control. Her power did not operate at the edges of society. It sat squarely within its accepted structures. That is precisely why her case matters. Accounts of Saltykova often begin with violence, or with numbers. They catalogue deaths, list punishments, and fixate on the shock that a noblewoman could be responsible for such harm. These accounts tend to move quickly toward moral explanation, cruelty, madness, monstrosity. The effect is dramatic, but it is also limiting. It places the weight of the story entirely on the individual and allows the structures that sustained her authority to recede quietly into the background. This book takes a different approach. Rather than asking first what kind of woman Saltykova was, it asks what kind of power she held, how that power functioned, and why it was so resistant to challenge. It treats her actions as inseparable from the system of serfdom, estate governance, gendered authority, and legal insulation that shaped everyday life in 18th-century Russia. Saltykova's violence did not occur in secret cellars or hidden lairs. It occurred on estates that functioned as private jurisdictions. Her victims were serfs, legally bound to her land, economically dependent on her will, and exposed to punishment that the law itself sanctioned. Complaints against her were not ignored because officials did not know how to act. They were ignored because the system was designed to protect landowners and to treat suffering within estates as a private matter unless it threatened state order. This distinction, between private authority and public concern, sits at the center of the story. For years, petitions against Saltykova circulated without effect. Some petitioners were punished for speaking. Others disappeared back into the silence of estate life. Local officials hesitated. Institutions deferred. Authority folded inward to protect itself. Only when the case reached Empress Catherine II, and only when it became useful to demonstrate the limits of noble immunity, did the state intervene decisively. By that point, harm had already been repeated many times. It is tempting, when faced with such a case, to frame it as exceptional. To imagine Saltykova as a deviation from an otherwise functional system. This book resists that temptation. Exceptional cruelty can exist, but cruelty does not persist for years without support. What sustained Saltykova's actions was not only her will, but a social and legal framework that placed the lives of serfs firmly beneath the threshold of urgent concern. The book therefore treats violence not as spectacle, but as outcome. It examines how estates operated as closed systems. How noble women were trained in authority without accountability. How serfdom transformed people into labor units and punishable bodies. How fear functioned as governance. How petitioning itself carried risk. Saltykova's gender complicates the story, but it does not explain it on its own. Much has been written about the shock of female violence, especially violence enacted by women in positions associated with domestic order. That shock often produces distorted narratives, either portraying such women as aberrant monsters or psychologizing them in ways unsupported by evidence. This book avoids both. Saltykova is not presented as a symbol of female depravity, nor as a puzzle to be solved through speculative interior life. The historical record does not allow confident claims about her emotional reasoning, and this book does not invent them. What it does allow is a careful reconstruction of her social position, legal authority, and the institutional responses that shaped the case. The victims are not treated as incidental. One of the dangers of writing about elite perpetrators is that the focus narrows toward power and personality, while those harmed recede into abstraction. This book resists that pattern by centering the conditions under which serfs lived and labored, particularly young women whose work placed them closest to household authority and discipline. Their vulnerability was not accidental. It was produced by law, custom, and economic dependence. At the same time, this is not a catalogue of suffering. The book does not linger on brutality for effect. It acknowledges harm without turning it into spectacle, recognizing that repetition and excess do not produce understanding, they produce numbness. Saltykova's punishment is often described as extraordinary: public humiliation, lifelong confinement, symbolic degradation of noble status. In reality, it was carefully calibrated. Execution was avoided. Property and lineage were largely preserved. The punishment functioned as a message rather than as systemic reform. It demonstrated that noble power had limits, while ensuring that those limits were set by the state, not by the law as experienced by serfs. This book treats punishment not as moral resolution, but as political theater. What followed Saltykova's death is as revealing as what preceded it. Her case entered Russian cultural memory as a cautionary tale, stripped of context and inflated by repetition. Numbers grew. Motives hardened. Complexity flattened. The estate system itself remained largely unchallenged. Serfdom continued. Private authority persisted. Silence returned. The story, then, is not about closure. It is about how societies manage fear by isolating individuals rather than interrogating structures. It is about how private spaces, estates, households, institutions, can function as zones of unchecked power when oversight is treated as intrusion. It is about how gender and class shape whose suffering counts and whose authority is presumed legitimate. This book is written with restraint because restraint is necessary. Historical true crime does not require invention to be compelling. It requires attention to systems, to limits of evidence, to the difference between what can be known and what is merely repeated. Where the record is strong, this book relies on it. Where it is thin, it does not pretend otherwise. What emerges is not a portrait of a monster, but a study of private sovereignty. Saltykova's life forces an uncomfortable recognition that extraordinary harm can arise from entirely ordinary arrangements when power is insulated, labor is dehumanized, and suffering is rendered invisible by law. The danger does not lie solely in individuals who abuse power. It lies in the confidence that such power will regulate itself. This book is offered not as judgment, and not as exoneration, but as examination. It asks how a woman like Darya Saltykova could act as she did for so long. It asks why so many people knew, yet so little changed. It asks what it took for the state to finally intervene, and why that intervention stopped where it did. And it asks the reader to sit with the possibility that the most disturbing aspect of the case is not cruelty itself, but how comfortably it was housed within the normal operations of authority. That is where the story begins. Chapter 1: Birth into Power. Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova was born into a world where authority was not earned. It was inherited. To be born noble in early 18th century Russia was to be born into a structure that assumed hierarchy as natural, and obedience as necessary. The state relied on the nobility to manage land, labor, and local order. Noble families relied on the state to protect their privileges and to treat their households and estates as private jurisdictions. Within this arrangement, power did not need to justify itself to those beneath it. It needed only to continue. Darya was born in 1730, commonly described as a member of the Ivanov noble family. The details of her early childhood are not preserved with the fullness modern readers might expect. That absence is not unusual. The lives of noble girls were considered private, and their daily formation rarely entered record unless it intersected with marriage, inheritance, or scandal. What survives is therefore a social outline rather than a personal diary, a girl raised in wealth, surrounded by servants and dependent labor, taught to understand authority as ordinary. This is not a psychological beginning. It is a structural one. Because the most important fact about Darya's early life is not a singular childhood incident. It is the environment that formed her, an environment in which other human beings existed as labor, and where the line between discipline and violence could be blurred by law, custom, and distance. In Russian noble households, the domestic sphere was not merely a family space. It was a workplace, an administrative center, and a training ground. Servants prepared meals, cleaned rooms, managed clothing, tended fires, and performed countless tasks that made noble comfort possible. On estates, serfs worked fields, maintained property, built structures, repaired roads, produced food, and delivered rents or labor obligations. This labor sustained the nobility materially and reinforced noble identity socially. A noble child grew up not only in comfort but in a continual demonstration of command. Such demonstrations shape perception. When a child sees adults issuing orders and being obeyed, authority becomes a fact of life rather than a topic of reflection. When a child sees that punishment is part of that authority, punishment becomes a tool rather than a moral question. When a child is served daily, service becomes background, the way the world works. It matters, too, that noble children were raised within a culture of hierarchy that ran in multiple directions at once. A noble family could be powerful locally and still subordinate to the imperial court. A noble father could exercise control over his household while remaining subject to the expectations of rank, patronage, and state service. Authority was therefore both personal and political. It was something one held, and something one navigated. A child in such a world learned early that protection came from position. This lesson was reinforced by religion. The Russian Orthodox Church was woven into noble life through ritual, instruction, and cultural expectation. Piety was not only belief. It was also legitimacy. A noble family was expected to model moral order, not necessarily through gentleness, but through adherence to recognized forms, church attendance, charity when convenient, proper observance, and public respectability. Religious language could also be used to sanctify hierarchy. Obedience could be presented as virtue. Endurance could be framed as spiritual duty. Those beneath could be urged to accept their place as divinely ordered. This did not mean that all nobles were consciously cruel or that all religious practice was hypocritical. It means that the cultural framework made hierarchy feel morally stable, even when it produced suffering. A noble girl's education was shaped by that framework. Formal schooling varied depending on family means, connections, and location, but the general aim was consistent: to prepare a girl to function within noble society as a wife, mother, household manager, and guardian of reputation. Her learning might include reading, writing, religious instruction, basic arithmetic, and the social arts that mattered in elite circles: manners, conversation, appearances, and an understanding of what was appropriate for her rank. The purpose of such education was not independence. It was preparation for authority exercised through household and family. A noble woman could hold real power, particularly within her home and estates, even if public authority was reserved largely for men. She could manage property, supervise servants, direct domestic routines, and make decisions that affected the lives of dependents. In some circumstances, especially widowhood, that power could expand significantly. A girl raised in a noble household learned these patterns by watching long before she was permitted to act. She learned which rooms were hers to enter and which belonged to men. She learned how servants behaved in her presence. She learned that a raised voice could change a room instantly. She learned that discipline could be delegated. She learned that punishments did not require explanation to those punished. She also learned the importance of reputation. In noble society, reputation was not merely personal. It was political capital. Families were judged by their alliances, their conduct, their displays of piety, their adherence to social expectations, and their ability to appear orderly. A noblewoman's reputation carried particular weight because she was expected to embody domestic virtue publicly while managing domestic reality privately. This gap between appearance and reality is not incidental. It is an enabling condition. When reputation is protected above truth, suffering can be hidden. When household order is prized above scrutiny, violence can be contained behind walls. When the state treats noble estates as private domains, the people within those domains become less visible to external authority. In Darya's early life, these conditions were not yet dramatic. They were simply the ordinary structure of her world. She would later marry into the Saltykova family, connecting herself to a powerful noble lineage. That marriage is often treated in retellings as a plot point on the way to later horror, but it deserves to be treated as what it was in her world, a consolidation of position. Marriage in noble society was rarely a purely personal matter. It was a strategic alignment between families. It secured property, produced heirs, and strengthened political networks. For a noblewoman, marriage was also a transfer of household authority. She moved into a new home, a new hierarchy, and a new role. She did not become powerless. She became positioned. Position was everything. From the perspective of those beneath, servants, serfs, household workers, the noblewoman's position could mean safety or terror depending on how she exercised it. Yet the structure itself ensured that her authority was assumed legitimate. The question was never whether she should have power. The question was only how she used it. This is why the book begins here, at birth, rather than at accusation. A case like Saltykova's cannot be understood as an eruption of evil into an otherwise neutral life. It must be understood as an event that grew inside a system that normalized extreme inequality. Her later actions may have been exceptional in scale or intensity, but her capacity to act, and to act without immediate consequence, was created by ordinary arrangements. The estate, in this world, functioned as a closed system. A closed system is one in which authority flows downward, and complaints struggle to move upward. A closed system produces silence because speaking is dangerous and because the channels of correction are controlled by those with interest in preserving the system's stability. A closed system can sustain harm for long periods because harm is treated as private, local, and beneath the threshold of official concern. Darya's childhood did not need to include cruelty for her to grow into a woman capable of cruelty. It needed only to teach her that other lives were subject to her will, that punishment was permissible, and that oversight was minimal. These lessons were embedded in noble life. They were not taught as crimes. They were taught as order. Chapter 2: Marriage as Consolidation. Marriage in the Russian nobility was not a private leap into a shared life. It was a public alignment. Families married to secure property, strengthen alliances, and stabilize inheritance. A noblewoman's marriage was therefore never merely about her. It joined households, linked reputations, and extended networks of obligation. It also made a woman legible in a particular way, as a wife within a recognized hierarchy, as a mother of future heirs, and as an administrator of domestic order. When Darya Nikolaevna married Gleb Alexeyevich Saltykov, she entered one of the most powerful currents of Russian noble life. The Saltykov name carried weight. It signaled proximity to court culture and participation in the broader machinery of noble service. Even when daily life was lived on estates rather than in palaces, the family's standing mattered. It protected members from scrutiny. It provided patronage. It shaped what officials were willing to do when conflict emerged. To understand Darya's later story, it is essential to understand what this marriage did in structural terms. It consolidated authority. A noble marriage did not usually remove a woman's capacity to exercise power. It redirected it. It placed her authority inside a household that had its own rhythms and expectations, and it trained her to govern dependents in a way that maintained the family's public standing. This is where the domestic sphere becomes crucial. The domestic sphere was not soft. It was managerial. It required organization of labor, oversight of servants, control of supplies, and the production of a household that appeared stable to visitors and neighbors. A noble household functioned as a display of competence. It was expected to be clean, orderly, and socially correct. Behind this appearance lay constant work, most of it performed by those of lower rank and controlled by those of higher. A noble wife was expected to sit at the center of that system. She supervised servants and set standards. She managed household routines. She was responsible for moral instruction and for the visible performance of piety and propriety. She shaped the household's social atmosphere: who was welcomed, who was dismissed, what was tolerated, what was punished. These duties could be delegated, but authority could not. The household's order reflected on its heads. In this sense, marriage was training. Darya, raised in a household of hierarchy, would have entered marriage with a working knowledge of authority and domestic governance. Yet marriage deepened that knowledge by making her responsible for its daily operation. A young noblewoman learned quickly what it meant to manage human labor. She learned how to correct servants, how to enforce standards, and how to signal power without constant direct engagement. Much of that signaling was achieved through structure. Who had access to rooms? Who spoke first? Who stood when she entered? Who was allowed to argue? Who could be punished without question? Power was made visible through routine. It is also likely that Darya's marriage brought her into closer relationship with estate life. Noble families often held multiple properties. Their time could be divided between city residences and rural estates, depending on social obligations, wealth, and the demands of state service. While her husband's activities may have kept him connected to broader networks, daily estate governance often fell to those at home. Women could become central administrators simply because they were present. Presence matters in closed systems. The person present becomes the person who decides. This does not mean a noblewoman acted alone. Estate staff existed. Stewards managed accounts. Senior servants carried out orders. Yet the authority behind those orders belonged to the landowner's household, and within that household, the noblewoman could exercise significant influence. Marriage also introduced another pressure: reproduction. A noble marriage was expected to produce heirs. Children were not merely family. They were continuity of property, name, and lineage. The birth of sons in particular secured inheritance patterns and strengthened a woman's position within the household. Motherhood could protect a noblewoman from certain forms of vulnerability, but it could also bind her more tightly to the family's interests. Most accounts state that Darya had 2 sons. The details of their childhood and her relationship with them are not preserved in a way that allows confident narrative reconstruction. Here again, the archive is uneven. The sons become relevant in later summaries because they represent inheritance and lineage, the parts of family life the record tends to preserve. The everyday texture of maternal life remains largely private. For this book, that absence is not treated as an invitation to invent. It is treated as evidence of what institutions chose to record. Still, structurally, children mattered. They increased the scale of the household. They increased dependence on servants. They increased the importance of order, cleanliness, and routine. They also increased the household's vulnerability to gossip, because children made family life more visible. A noblewoman was expected to maintain a household that appeared disciplined and morally sound, not only for her own reputation but for the future prospects of her children. This expectation intensified control. A household that runs on servants must constantly regulate servants. Servants move, talk, observe, and sometimes judge. Their presence threatens privacy even as it enables comfort. The response to this threat is often discipline, clear rules, strict roles, punishments for deviation, and the constant reinforcement of hierarchy. In estate settings, this discipline extended beyond household servants to serfs more broadly. Serfdom provided the nobility with labor and wealth. It also created a moral economy in which human beings were managed like resources. That management could be brutal even when it was not legally prosecuted. The line between discipline and abuse could be drawn so widely in favor of the landowner that the concept of abuse itself became difficult to define within official structures. A noblewoman raised in and reinforced by such a system could therefore exercise harsh authority without seeing it as extraordinary. Harshness could be reframed as order. Pain could be reframed as correction. Fear could be reframed as respect. This is not an argument that cruelty was inevitable. It is an argument that the system provided language that could excuse cruelty and a structure that could conceal it. Marriage also provided insulation. To be a married woman of noble rank was to be protected by family name and network. Even if conflict emerged within the household or on estates, outsiders approached such matters cautiously. Officials were reluctant to challenge powerful families. Neighbors were reluctant to speak openly. Servants and serfs were reluctant to complain because complaint could rebound. This insulation created a critical condition: delay. Harm can persist in a closed system because the costs of intervention are high and the mechanisms of intervention are controlled by those with power. Marriage strengthened Darya's insulation by embedding her within the Saltykova network and by presenting her publicly as a legitimate noble wife, not as an isolated figure. Isolation came later, and it mattered more. Because the true turning point in her authority did not occur at marriage. It occurred at widowhood. Widowhood removed the most immediate internal check within noble hierarchy, the presence of a husband who could, at least in theory, restrain, redirect, or supervise household practice. Widowhood also transferred property control more fully into her hands, depending on inheritance arrangements. Even when male relatives remained involved, the day-to-day reality of authority often shifted toward the widow because she was the one present on the land. Presence again becomes decisive. In 1755, Darya was widowed. The significance of this date is not sentimental. It is structural. It marks the point at which the consolidations of birth and marriage become something closer to sovereignty, a woman with property, rank, and legal authority over others, operating largely within private space. Chapter 3: Widowhood and Absolute Control. Widowhood is often spoken of as loss. In the world of 18th-century Russian nobility, it was also a transfer of authority. When Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova became a widow in 1755, the event changed not only her household but her legal and practical relationship to power. A noble marriage positioned a woman within an existing hierarchy. Widowhood could reposition her at the top of it, not publicly in the way men occupied public office, but privately in a form that mattered as much: control of land, labor, and discipline. In a society built on estates, private authority was not secondary. It was foundational. A widow with property could exercise a degree of command that a married woman might have shared or negotiated. Even if male relatives remained involved in inheritance matters, the day-to-day governance of estates often became the widow's responsibility because she was present, and because the estate itself demanded constant management. Presence matters more than paper authority. A landowner's power is made real through daily decisions: who is assigned to what work, what is punished, what is overlooked, how disputes are handled, which servants are favored, which are degraded, when food is rationed, when labor is intensified. These decisions are not made once. They are made continually. The person who makes them becomes, in practical terms, sovereign. For Darya, widowhood placed her closer to that sovereignty. To understand what this means, it is necessary to be precise about the estate as a political unit. The estate was not simply farmland. It was an economy. It was a labor system. It was a community defined by coercion. Serfs lived on the land, worked it, and owed labor and obedience. The landowner, in turn, owed the state taxes, service obligations, and loyalty. Between state and serf stood the landowner, a private authority whose decisions shaped daily life far more than distant laws. This arrangement created a distinctive kind of isolation. An estate could be large. It could include multiple villages. It could include manor houses, outbuildings, workshops, and domestic quarters. It could be physically distant from urban centers and from frequent oversight. In such settings, the household's internal logic could become self-contained. Rules were enforced by those already invested in the landowner's power: stewards, overseers, senior servants, and household officials. Even when abuse was visible, the mechanisms for challenging it were weak. A serf could complain only upward, through channels controlled by the same class that benefited from serf labor. Petitioning was possible, but it was dangerous. A complaint could be intercepted. It could be dismissed. It could be punished. The complainant could be beaten, sold, transferred, or otherwise disciplined as an example. This danger is not a side note. It is a central reason harm can persist. Widowhood did not create this system. It simply placed Darya in a position to exercise it with fewer immediate internal constraints. There is another element that must be kept in view: the cultural meaning of widowhood in noble society. Widowhood could carry a kind of respectability. A widow could be seen as solemn, pious, and morally steady. She might control her household with firmer hand because she was expected to uphold order in the absence of a husband. Her authority could be framed as necessary, even admirable. A strict widow might be praised as disciplined rather than questioned as cruel. This framing matters because it can protect behavior that would otherwise draw attention. It also places a particular emphasis on the private sphere. If a widow is expected to manage her household and estate responsibly, then outsiders may hesitate to interfere. Interference could be interpreted as disrespect, or as an accusation against the widow's moral capacity. In a hierarchical culture, hesitation becomes habit. Habit produces delay. Darya's widowhood also intersected with motherhood. As a widow with sons, she occupied a dual role: guardian of the estate and guardian of the lineage. Her authority could be seen as temporary in a dynastic sense. She held property and power until sons matured, but in practical terms she might wield that power fully for years. This kind of temporary authority can be intense because it is framed as responsibility, and responsibility can justify harshness. The estate must be kept productive. The household must be kept orderly. The lineage must be protected. When authority is justified as protection of these goals, those beneath become instruments rather than people. The record does not allow us to see Darya's private reflections in these years. It does allow us to observe what later became visible: the allegations that violence intensified and repeated. It is tempting to imagine a dramatic transformation at widowhood, grief hardening into cruelty, or freedom unleashing hidden darkness. This book does not rely on that kind of narrative. Instead, it treats widowhood as the moment when structural conditions aligned. A woman with rank. A woman with legal authority. A woman with control of estates. A woman operating largely within private space. A labor system that made victims captive. A state reluctant to intrude. When these conditions converge, harm can become both possible and persistent. To say this is not to claim that any widow would behave as Darya did. It is to insist that the system created an environment where an individual's extremes could play out with unusually little interruption. What does control look like on an estate? It looks like surveillance. Estates ran on watching. Overseers watched labor. Senior servants watched junior servants. Household staff watched serfs assigned to domestic duties. People watched one another because punishment could fall unpredictably, and because fear encourages self-protection. It also looks like delegation. A landowner did not need to strike every blow herself. She could command it. She could instruct others to carry out discipline. She could create a climate where harsh punishment was expected and where subordinates anticipated her desires. This is one of the reasons violence can become routinized in closed systems. It does not rely on a single person's constant physical action. It relies on a chain of authority. Chains are durable. A landowner could also control movement. Serfs could be transferred between villages, assigned to harder labor, moved into domestic service, or sent away. These movements could function as punishment and as containment. A victim could be removed from familiar networks. A witness could be separated from others. A complainant could be made an example by being relocated or disciplined publicly. Movement, in this context, was not freedom. It was control. A landowner could control food and comfort. Food was a lever. Warmth was a lever. Clothing was a lever. A person who depends on you for basic survival can be controlled without constant overt violence. Threat and deprivation can achieve compliance. Violence, when used, becomes the final reinforcement of an already unequal arrangement. In later accounts, Saltykova's alleged victims are often described as young women. This is consistent with the vulnerability created by domestic labor assignments. Young women working close to the manor house were under constant scrutiny, and their work was evaluated not only for productivity but for propriety. Mistakes could be framed as insolence. Delays could be framed as laziness. Small faults could be magnified into moral failures. The proximity that created employment also created exposure. Within the manor household, a noblewoman could exercise intimate control over tasks, demeanor, bodily presence, and punishment. In such spaces, the line between household discipline and personal cruelty could disappear entirely, and the victims had few safe places to retreat. It is also important to recognize that the manor household was not a neutral workplace. It was a symbol of rank. Domestic laborers were not just workers, they were reminders of hierarchy. Their obedience confirmed the noblewoman's status. When obedience faltered, the status itself could feel threatened. In a culture that treated rank as identity, perceived threat could provoke disproportionate response. Again, this is not psychologizing. It is structural. Identity and power were fused. Loss of control could be experienced not as inconvenience but as challenge to legitimacy. This is one reason the estate can become a theater of punishment. Punishment is performance. It instructs the population. It demonstrates what happens when rules are broken. It teaches fear. It also reassures the punisher of her own authority. In the years after 1755, the estate became the space where Darya's authority operated with minimal interruption. Yet minimal interruption does not mean total invisibility. People knew. People spoke quietly. Some attempted to petition. The crucial question becomes, how did knowledge fail to become action? That question leads directly into the next section of the book. Before we follow petitions and investigation, we must first understand the estate itself as a closed domestic economy, the daily labor systems, the gendered vulnerability of domestic workers, and the way serfdom allowed harm to be treated as private until it became politically useful to make it public. Chapter 4: Serfdom as Domestic Economy. To understand how harm could persist on Saltykova's estates, it is necessary to understand serfdom not as background injustice, but as a functioning system of everyday life. Serfdom in 18th century Russia was not simply a labor arrangement. It was a comprehensive social order. It defined where people lived, what work they performed, who could discipline them, how they could move, and whether their suffering would be recognized as legally meaningful. Within this order, the estate functioned as a domestic economy in the fullest sense. It produced food, labor, wealth, and obedience under a single authority. That authority was private. Serfs were legally bound to the land and to the landowner. They were not slaves in the strictest legal sense, but their freedom was sharply limited. They could not leave without permission. They could be bought, sold, transferred, or reassigned. Their marriages could be controlled. Their labor could be intensified. Punishment was permitted within broad limits, and those limits were rarely enforced in ways that favored serfs. What this created was a system in which the landowner's household was also a governing institution. The estate did not merely employ people. It ruled them. Labor on estates was divided by gender, age, and perceived capacity. Men were assigned to agricultural work, construction, transport, and heavy labor. Women were assigned to domestic service, textile work, food preparation, childcare, and tasks that placed them closer to the manor house. These assignments were not neutral. Proximity to the household brought certain privileges, better food, shelter, reduced field labor, but it also brought exposure. Exposure to scrutiny. Exposure to discipline. Exposure to personal authority. Domestic laborers were watched more closely because they were closer to power. They were also punished more visibly because their behavior reflected directly on the household's order. The manor house itself functioned as both home and command center. It was where orders were given, where punishments were authorized, where disputes were resolved, and where the boundary between acceptable discipline and excessive cruelty was drawn, often by the same person who benefited from that discipline. There was no neutral oversight built into this arrangement. Stewards and overseers answered upward, not outward. Their loyalty lay with the landowner, not with the serfs. This loyalty was not abstract. It was material. Stewards depended on landowners for position, income, and protection. Overseers depended on landowners for continued authority. Senior servants depended on landowners for favor. Each layer of the hierarchy had reason to maintain the system as it was. Reporting abuse was risky. Ignoring it was safe. Safety shapes behavior. In such an environment, suffering becomes routine. Not because people are indifferent to pain, but because acknowledging pain requires action, and action carries cost. When a system punishes those who speak and rewards those who comply, silence becomes rational. The domestic economy of serfdom also blurred responsibility. When punishment is delegated, no single person appears fully accountable. A landowner may order discipline without administering it. An overseer may administer discipline while claiming obedience to orders. A servant may witness harm while insisting it is not their place to intervene. Each actor can point elsewhere. The system absorbs responsibility by dispersing it. This diffusion is crucial. It allows extreme outcomes to emerge without a clear moment where the system says, stop. Instead, there are many small decisions that align in the same direction: harsher discipline, less tolerance, quicker punishment, fewer appeals. Over time, these decisions create a climate where violence feels normal, even inevitable. For serfs, especially women working close to the manor, this climate was inescapable. Domestic serfs lived under constant evaluation. Their work was not measured solely by output but by comportment. Cleanliness, obedience, silence, and deference were part of the job. Failure in any of these areas could be framed as moral fault rather than as mistake. Moral fault invited punishment that was justified not as cruelty, but as correction. Correction was a powerful word. It framed pain as necessary. It framed authority as benevolent. It framed resistance as deviance. Within this logic, the person inflicting punishment could see themselves as maintaining order rather than causing harm. The estate's economy also relied on fear. Fear ensured compliance without constant force. The possibility of punishment, unpredictable, uneven, and personal, kept people cautious. Fear discouraged solidarity among serfs. Fear discouraged collective complaint. Fear made survival an individual project rather than a shared one. This fragmentation mattered. A fragmented population cannot easily organize resistance or articulate shared grievance. Each person calculates risk alone. Each person wonders whether speaking will make things worse. Each person watches what happens to others who speak. In Saltykova's case, later testimony suggests that serfs did speak, quietly, repeatedly, and at great risk. That they were punished for doing so is not evidence of exceptional malice alone. It is evidence of how the system defended itself. Petitions that did escape the estate did not land in a neutral space. Officials receiving complaints about noble landowners faced their own calculations. Intervening against a powerful family could damage careers. Ignoring complaints was easier, especially when those complaints came from people legally defined as dependents rather than as rights-bearing citizens. The law provided room for discretion, and discretion often favored the powerful. This is why the estate must be understood as a domestic economy rather than merely as a workplace. Domestic economies operate on intimacy, hierarchy, and repetition. They are resistant to external audit. They are organized around trust upward and obedience downward. When harm emerges within them, it is often reframed as internal disorder rather than as a public problem. Saltykova's estates were not aberrant in their structure. They were extreme in outcome, but ordinary in design. That ordinariness is uncomfortable. It suggests that the conditions enabling harm were widely shared, even if the harm itself was not always so visible or so severe. It suggests that many estates contained smaller versions of the same dynamics: unchecked authority, silenced suffering, delayed intervention. The domestic economy of serfdom also shaped how victims were perceived. Serfs were often treated as interchangeable. Their deaths could be explained away as illness, weakness, or accident. The loss of one laborer could be absorbed by the system. When loss accumulates slowly, it may not trigger alarm until it reaches a scale that threatens productivity or reputation. This calculus is brutal, but it is structural. Lives were weighed not as lives, but as units of labor. When labor shortages became noticeable, questions might be asked. Until then, suffering could be contained within the estate's internal logic. This containment is what makes Saltykova's case so revealing. It shows how long a system can tolerate harm when that harm is distributed among the powerless and hidden within routine. It shows how violence can become part of the estate's rhythm rather than a rupture of it. Chapter 5: Women, Labor, and Vulnerability. On an 18th-century Russian estate, women did not occupy a single category. They occupied a range of labor roles shaped by age, strength, reproductive status, and proximity to the manor household. Yet across these roles, one fact remained constant: women's work was deeply entangled with private authority. This entanglement made women central to the estate's functioning. It also made them especially exposed. When later accounts of Darya Saltykova's case emphasize that many victims were young women, they often treat that detail as a clue to personal preference or private cruelty. This book treats it first as a structural outcome. The estate placed young women in positions where surveillance was constant, discipline was intimate, and punishment could be justified as correction of both labor and behavior. To understand that vulnerability, we must begin with the division of labor. Women's labor on estates included fieldwork, but it also included tasks that kept the manor household alive: cooking, cleaning, laundry, sewing, childcare, and the maintenance of domestic order. Women might also be assigned to support work: carrying water, tending fires, feeding animals, preparing supplies, and assisting overseers' households. Much of this work took place within enclosed spaces: kitchens, storerooms, sculleries, bedrooms, where witnesses were limited and authority was immediate. Enclosure changes risk. In open fields, punishment is public and in some cases, regulated by custom because it is witnessed by many. In enclosed domestic spaces, punishment can be private, impulsive, and intensified without interruption. Privacy does not only protect households, it can also protect harm. Domestic labor also creates proximity. A young woman working in or near the manor is physically close to those with power. She moves through spaces that belong to them. She handles objects that belong to them. She cleans their rooms, touches their clothing, prepares their food, tends their children. This proximity can be interpreted as threat or insolence even when it is necessary labor. A servant's simple presence can become charged because it blurs the boundary between rank and intimacy. Rank depends on boundaries. Domestic work disrupts boundaries by necessity. This disruption produces a particular kind of discipline aimed not only at labor output, but at reinforcing hierarchy. Servants are corrected to remind them of their place. Their voices are controlled. Their expressions are policed. Their bodies are regulated: where they stand, how they look, when they move, how quickly they respond. Women were especially subject to this regulation because female servants were often judged as moral symbols. Their cleanliness was linked to moral purity. Their obedience was linked to sexual propriety. Their silence was linked to virtue. A disorderly servant could be framed as not merely incompetent, but morally suspect. Moral suspicion authorized punishment in ways that were culturally persuasive. It allowed the punisher to claim righteousness rather than rage. This is one of the mechanisms by which gender intensifies vulnerability. A young female servant could be punished not only for spilling or delaying, but for imagined attitude, impertinence, stubbornness, laziness, insolence. These terms are flexible. They can be applied to almost anything. They are difficult to disprove because they are interpretations rather than measurable acts. Flexible accusations are powerful because they cannot be safely defended against. If a woman argues back, she confirms the charge of insolence. If she remains silent, she may be punished anyway. The structure offers little space for safe response. Women's bodies were also controlled through reproductive vulnerability. Marriage among serfs could be managed or constrained by a state authority. Pregnancy altered labor assignments and could be used as a lever of control. A pregnant woman could be punished for reduced productivity. She could be accused of weakness or idleness. She could be treated as inconvenient. If she lost a child, the loss could be blamed on her moral failings rather than on conditions of labor and stress. Even when not explicitly discussed, reproduction shaped how female laborers were treated, as bodies that produced future labor units, and as bodies whose sexuality needed regulation within the estate's moral order. This regulation was often enforced by women as well as men. One of the most uncomfortable truths about hierarchical systems is that women can act as instruments of patriarchal and class authority while still being constrained by it. A noblewoman might have limited public power, but she could wield extensive private power over other women. The estate allowed this. It legitimized a noblewoman's domestic authority precisely because it was framed as feminine: household order, discipline, moral management. This framing could make a noblewoman's cruelty harder to name as cruelty. If discipline is seen as part of domestic virtue, then harshness can be reframed as strength. A strict mistress can be praised for maintaining standards. Those beneath may be blamed for provoking punishment. This moral framing shifts responsibility downward. Downward shifts of responsibility are one of the estate's most persistent habits. There is also the question of visibility. Young female servants were visible to the mistress in a way that male field laborers were not. Their work occurred under the mistress's gaze. They were corrected directly. Their bodies moved through her space. Their mistakes were experienced as disruptions of her environment. This visibility increased opportunities for conflict and punishment simply because the relationship was continuous. Continuous relationships intensify control. A mistress might not notice a particular field worker every day. She would notice the girl who brought water, scrubbed floors, dressed beds, or answered bells. Domestic laborers became the human texture of the mistress's daily life. If the mistress demanded absolute submission, these laborers would be the ones most often forced to perform it. Performance itself becomes exhausting. To survive in such an environment, a young woman had to learn to read moods, anticipate demands, and avoid attracting attention. She had to manage not only tasks but emotional climates. This kind of labor, emotional vigilance, is rarely acknowledged as labor. Yet it is central to domestic service under threat. When the emotional climate is volatile, vigilance becomes constant. Constant vigilance wears people down. It increases mistakes. It increases fear. It narrows the body's ability to recover. In a system where mistakes are punished harshly, the very stress of survival can produce the behavior that is then punished again. This is how closed systems can produce escalating cycles. The women under Saltykova's authority were not only laborers. They were also potential witnesses. They saw. They knew. They spoke quietly to one another. Some attempted to petition. Others may have hoped to flee. The estate's response to witness potential was often to intensify control rather than to reduce harm. Control can be used to preempt complaint. A woman who is isolated cannot coordinate with others. A woman who is terrified cannot speak freely. A woman who has watched others punished for speaking will silence herself. This is why the vulnerability of women cannot be separated from the vulnerability of testimony. The same conditions that placed women close to harm also place them close to knowledge, and knowledge itself was a threat to private authority. The case against Saltykova eventually depended on testimony. That testimony did not emerge from a free environment. It emerged from fear. It emerged from risk. It emerged from a system designed to suppress it. The fact that testimony emerged at all tells us something crucial, that the suffering was not invisible to everyone, and that the urge to seek redress persisted even when redress was unlikely. This persistence becomes a central thread in the next chapters. Before we move into petitioning and investigation, we must sit with one more reality: how violence can become routine without losing its terror. Routine does not mean mild. Routine means absorbed. It means the estate continues to function around harm, and that those within it learn to live as if harm is part of the normal order. Chapter 6: Violence without witness. Violence does not always announce itself as rupture. In closed systems, it is more often absorbed into routine. On estates governed by private authority, punishment could occur frequently enough that it ceased to feel exceptional. This did not make it less terrifying to those subjected to it. It made it harder to interrupt. When violence becomes part of the rhythm of daily life, it loses its capacity to shock those with power, even as it continues to shape the lives of those beneath. This is one of the most dangerous features of closed systems, their ability to normalize harm without naming it. In the case of Saltykova's estates, later testimony describes repeated punishment, escalating severity, and a climate of fear. These descriptions are often summarized in modern retellings as evidence of sadism or madness. Such labels may satisfy curiosity, but they obscure something more instructive: how violence can persist when it is structurally permitted and socially insulated. The estate did not require secrecy in the modern sense. It required containment. Containment meant that violence occurred where witnesses were limited, dependent, or afraid. It meant that those who saw were those least able to speak. It meant that knowledge circulated horizontally among serfs but rarely traveled upward in a way that forced action. Witness, in this context, did not mean absence of awareness. It meant absence of consequence. Serfs knew what happened to others. They watched punishments. They learned which behaviors provoked rage, which earned reprieve, which offered no protection at all. This knowledge shaped their conduct. It also shaped their silence. Silence was not ignorance. It was strategy. The structure of the estate rewarded that strategy. Those who complied survived longer. Those who avoided attention reduced risk. Those who spoke were singled out. This does not mean that all endured quietly. Some attempted to escape. Some attempted to petition. Some resisted in small, covert ways. But resistance in a closed system rarely produces immediate change. More often, it produces retaliation. Retaliation reinforces fear. Fear reinforces compliance. Compliance reinforces authority. This feedback loop is what allows violence to continue without external interruption. It is also what makes later intervention appear sudden and shocking, when in reality the harm has been accumulating quietly for years. Violence on estates could be direct or delegated. A landowner could punish personally. She could also instruct overseers or servants to do so. Delegation served multiple purposes. It preserved the landowner's dignity. It diffused responsibility. It created layers of compliance, where each person involved could claim obedience rather than intent. Delegation also extends violence beyond a single body. When punishment is delegated, it becomes institutional. It can be carried out even when the landowner is absent. It becomes predictable in its unpredictability. Those beneath learn that violence does not depend on mood alone. It depends on position. Position is harder to escape than temperament. This is why focusing on personality alone is misleading. Even if Saltykova's behavior was extreme, it was enacted through mechanisms that already existed. The estate did not need to invent new forms of control to sustain harm. It needed only to apply existing ones relentlessly. Relentlessness is not always loud. Repeated punishment does not require constant rage. It requires consistency. It requires the willingness to punish again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Over time, the accumulation of punishment erodes bodies and spirits. Death can follow without a single dramatic moment. This is how violence hides behind gradual decline. A serf who weakens may be accused of laziness. A serf who falls ill may be accused of feigning. A serf who collapses may be blamed for her own fragility. The system provides language to explain away harm as failure of the victim rather than as consequence of abuse. This language protects authority. It also shapes how deaths are interpreted. In an era with limited medical knowledge and high mortality, death could often be explained as natural, especially when the dead were already weakened by labor and stress. A death might not trigger immediate alarm unless it occurred in unusual circumstances or in numbers that disrupted productivity. Productivity is a revealing threshold. When labor loss threatens output, attention increases. When labor loss is absorbed, attention diminishes. This is not because landowners were indifferent to death in the abstract. It is because the system valued continuity of production. Individual lives were replaceable within that logic. Replacement is a form of erasure. A serf who died could be replaced by reassignment of labor. A young woman could be transferred from field to house. A family could be split to meet needs. These adjustments kept the estate functioning. They also obscured the cumulative toll of harm. The estate's ability to adapt is one of its most dangerous features. Adaptation allows harm to persist without triggering crisis. Each loss is absorbed. Each punishment is rationalized. Each witness learns to survive rather than to speak. The presence of fear further distorts perception. Fear narrows attention. It pushes people to focus on immediate survival rather than on long-term change. It discourages collective action. It encourages secrecy even among those who share suffering. When fear is pervasive, silence becomes the dominant language. Silence, however, does not mean absence of knowledge. Knowledge circulates in whispers, glances, and shared understanding. Serfs knew which tasks were dangerous, which rooms were unsafe, which moments were volatile. They learned patterns. They learned when to hide, when to comply, when to disappear into the crowd. This knowledge did not protect them from harm entirely. It allowed some to survive longer. It allowed others to bear witness internally, even if they could not act. The estate thus becomes a place where violence is both known and unspeakable. This duality is essential to understanding why the case took so long to surface. It is not that no one knew. It is that knowing did not automatically produce a pathway to safety. When petitions were attempted, they carried enormous risk. Petitioning required literacy or access to someone literate. It required movement beyond the estate. It required trust in intermediaries. It required belief that someone in authority would listen. Each of these requirements could fail. Each failure could be punished. Punishment for petitioning sends a powerful message. It teaches that the system protects itself. It teaches that suffering is safer than protest. It teaches that authority will close ranks. Such lessons do not need to be taught often. Once demonstrated, they persist. In this environment, the absence of witnesses in the legal sense does not mean absence of witnesses in the human sense. It means that witnesses are trapped within the system they might accuse. Violence without witness is therefore not violence without awareness. It is violence without consequence. This distinction matters because it shifts responsibility outward. It reminds us that the question is not simply why did no one speak, but what happened when people tried? The answer in this case is that speaking often made things worse, until it did not. The breaking point did not come from a single act of courage. It came from accumulation. It came from repetition that became too large to contain quietly. It came from petitions that reached beyond local channels. It came from a political moment in which intervention became useful to the state. Chapter 7: The Act of Petitioning. When you live under a closed authority, justice is not something you expect. It is something you attempt. Petitioning was one of the few mechanisms available to Russian serfs who sought relief from abuse, but it was not designed for them. It existed within a political culture that treated hierarchy as legitimate and private authority as largely sacrosanct. To petition against a noble landowner was therefore to push against the grain of the system itself. That push carried risk. A petition was not simply a document. It was evidence of defiance. It announced that a serf believed the landowner's conduct had crossed a boundary that higher authority should recognize. Even if the petition was framed respectfully, as petitions usually were, the act of sending it implied dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction was dangerous. To understand why the case against Saltykova took years to advance, we must begin with what it took for a petition to exist at all. Most serfs were not literate. Literacy was uneven, often limited, and in many places actively discouraged because it created potential for coordination and complaint. A serf who wished to petition therefore needed access to someone who could write: a clerk, a priest, a literate servant, a town intermediary, or another person with enough education to produce a formal document. Access itself was a vulnerability. To seek a writer was to reveal intention. It required trust in someone who might betray the attempt to the landowner or to her representatives. In a system where the landowner's power reached into local networks, betrayal was not only possible but likely. If a petition was discovered before it left the estate, punishment could be immediate. Discovery also did not require modern surveillance. It could occur through simple observation: someone seen speaking with the wrong person, someone absent at the wrong time, someone carrying paper. Closed systems are highly sensitive to irregularity, and irregularity draws attention. Assuming the petition was written, the next challenge was delivery. A petition needed to reach a place where it could be received and recorded. That meant movement beyond the estate's internal channels. It meant reaching local officials, regional authorities, or, in rarer cases, the imperial court. Movement was controlled. Serfs could not simply travel freely. They required permission, and permission would not be granted for an act of complaint. So petitioning often relied on disguise, opportunity, or intermediaries. This created another point of vulnerability: interception. A petition could be intercepted by local officials who owed loyalty to the noble class. It could be dismissed quietly. It could be returned to the landowner. The petitioner might never know what happened to the document, only that nothing changed, and that danger increased. In some cases, petitioners were punished not because the petition succeeded, but because the attempt became known. Punishment for petitioning served a dual purpose. It harmed the individual. It warned everyone else. The warning is often the more important part. A closed system maintains itself by making examples. It does not need to punish every act of resistance. It needs only to punish enough acts that fear becomes self-sustaining. Within this framework, it is easy to see why petitioning could fail repeatedly without producing broader rebellion. Rebellion requires coordination. Coordination requires trust. Trust is difficult to build when punishment falls on those who speak. Yet petitions against Saltykova did exist. Later accounts commonly describe repeated attempts by serfs to bring their suffering to higher authority, culminating in a petition that reached Empress Catherine II. The details of each individual petition and its precise route through bureaucracy are not always preserved clearly in accessible summaries. What is clear is the pattern: complaint, dismissal, retaliation, renewed complaint. This pattern is itself evidence of system failure. The state's relationship with the nobility depended on cooperation. Nobles were expected to govern their estates and provide service to the state. In exchange, they were granted wide latitude within their own domains. Interfering too readily in estate discipline risked destabilizing that relationship. It risked signaling that the state did not trust nobles to manage their own affairs. So officials often chose the easiest path: treat complaints as local matters. Local matters, however, are exactly where closed systems trap people. If the landowner controls the local environment, then local resolution means returning complaint to the very authority being accused. This is a common pattern in hierarchical systems. Grievances are redirected downward, not upward. The result is not resolution but reinforcement of power. For serfs petitioning against Saltykova, this reinforcement could be brutal. A complainant might be beaten. A complainant might be reassigned to harsher labor. A complainant might be separated from family. A complainant might be sold or moved. These punishments were not only physical. They were social and economic. They attacked the foundations of survival. And yet petitioning persisted. This persistence tells us something essential about the scale of suffering. People do not repeatedly risk ruin for minor grievances. They do so when life becomes unbearable, when fear no longer outweighs desperation, or when the pattern of harm becomes so extreme that the risk of silence begins to feel greater than the risk of speech. Desperation can be a form of courage. It can also be a form of calculation. If you believe you will die anyway, the cost of trying becomes lower. The question, then, is why a petition finally succeeded. A petition's success is rarely only about its content. It is about timing and usefulness. For a case to advance, it must become legible as a threat not only to individual lives but to the state's own interests. It must be framed in a way that the state cannot easily ignore without losing legitimacy. In the early years of Catherine II's reign, legitimacy mattered intensely. Catherine had come to power through political upheaval, and she cultivated an image of rational governance and lawful authority. She positioned herself as a modernizing ruler attentive to justice, even while preserving the fundamental structures of aristocratic privilege. This tension created a narrow opening. She could act against an individual noble as a demonstration of state power and moral order, without challenging the nobility as a class. Saltykova's case fit that opening. It was dramatic enough to justify intervention. It was contained enough to avoid systemic reform. It involved victims whose status made them vulnerable, but whose suffering could be used to demonstrate imperial benevolence. It allowed Catherine to display authority over nobles without undermining noble privilege in general. This is the political logic that can turn a petition into action. The petition reaching Catherine was not simply heard. It became useful. Once usefulness emerged, the state could move. Arrest could occur without appearing to threaten every noble landowner. Investigation could proceed under imperial mandate. Witnesses could be gathered and protected, at least temporarily, because the case now had backing that local networks could not easily override. Backing changes everything. Backing creates a shield for those who speak. It shifts fear from below to above. It signals that the landowner's immunity is not absolute. It interrupts the closed system by introducing an authority greater than the estate. For the serfs, this would have felt like a rupture in reality. The estate, which had functioned as the whole world, suddenly had an outside. The mistress who had seemed untouchable was now touched by the state. But rupture does not bring immediate safety. When the state enters a closed system, it still relies on testimony, and testimony is difficult to extract from fear. Witnesses may speak cautiously. They may minimize. They may contradict each other. They may be too traumatized or too strategic to speak fully. The process of turning suffering into legal evidence is slow. That slowness becomes the next stage of the story. Chapter 8: Rumor, Knowledge, and Silence. Long before a case enters official record, it exists as knowledge without protection. On Saltykova's estates, violence was not a secret in the sense of being unknown. It was a secret in the sense of being unsayable. People knew what happened. They adjusted their behaviour around it. They warned one another quietly. They learned which spaces were dangerous and which moments offered brief safety. Knowledge circulated horizontally, among those who shared vulnerability, while remaining blocked from moving upward in ways that forced action. This distinction matters. Modern readers often assume that if something is widely known, it must eventually be addressed. In closed systems, the opposite can be true. The more widely something is known among the powerless, the more carefully it is managed to avoid punishment. Knowledge becomes something to carry, not something to speak. Rumor is one of the forms that knowledge takes when speech is constrained. Rumor is often dismissed as unreliable, but in systems of fear it serves a vital function. It allows information to move without attaching it to a single speaker. It allows warning without accusation. It allows people to orient themselves without leaving a clear trail of responsibility. On an estate, rumor might sound like this: avoid that corridor. Do not be alone at that hour. Do not answer back. If she is angry, disappear. These are not stories told for entertainment. They are instructions for survival. Rumor also allows people to test boundaries. A whisper passed between servants gauges whether others have noticed the same pattern. A shared glance confirms recognition. Silence after a warning may mean danger. Silence with understanding may mean solidarity. In this way, rumor becomes a social map of risk. Yet rumor has limits. It does not protect against authority. It does not stop punishment. It does not produce accountability. It helps people endure. It does not help them escape. One of the most damaging features of closed systems is the way they force people to choose between truth and safety. Speaking truth can make danger immediate. Silence can postpone it. Over time, this choice becomes habitual. Silence is no longer experienced as cowardice. It is experienced as competence. Competence, in such environments, means knowing when not to speak. This is why the presence of rumor does not contradict the absence of intervention. Rumor indicates awareness. Intervention requires power. Local officials were often aware as well. Estate neighbors, clerics, minor administrators, and stewards might hear fragments. They might suspect patterns. They might even believe the rumors. But belief alone did not compel action. Action required backing, and backing required political will. In many cases, officials faced competing incentives. Intervening against a powerful landowner could damage careers. Ignoring complaints protected relationships. Deferring action preserved stability. Stability, in hierarchical systems, is often valued more than justice. This is not because officials were uniformly cruel or indifferent. It is because they operated within a framework that rewarded discretion and punished disruption. The safest decision was often to do nothing, especially when victims were serfs whose legal standing was weak. In such a context, rumor becomes a kind of pressure without release. It builds anxiety. It confirms fear. It spreads awareness. But it does not break the system. In fact, it can sometimes reinforce it by encouraging people to manage danger privately rather than challenge it publicly. Silence functions similarly. Silence is not always imposed. It is often chosen under constraint. A serf who remains silent may be protecting children, parents, siblings. A servant who says nothing may be calculating that survival today is worth more than uncertain justice tomorrow. Silence becomes a form of care, not only for oneself, but for others who would suffer if retaliation spread. This is why judging silence retrospectively is dangerous. Silence is not absence of moral awareness. It is often evidence of acute awareness of consequence. When the case against Saltykova eventually advanced, this long history of rumor and silence shaped the investigation. Witnesses did not emerge as confident narrators with clear timelines and consistent details. They emerged cautiously, fragmentarily, and sometimes contradictorily. Trauma distorts memory. Fear shapes speech. Years of enforced silence make sudden openness difficult. Courts often struggle with this. Legal systems prefer linear narratives. They prefer clear sequences, named perpetrators, and stable testimony. When witnesses hesitate or contradict one another, their credibility is questioned. Yet such hesitation is precisely what one would expect from people who have survived long-term abuse in a closed system. The court's demand for clarity can therefore clash with the reality of lived experience. In Saltykova's case, the accumulation of testimony mattered more than perfect consistency. Patterns emerged across accounts. Similar forms of punishment were described. Similar outcomes were noted. Similar fears were expressed. The repetition of themes, rather than the precision of individual details, gave the case weight. This shift, from individual story to collective pattern, is how rumor begins to transform into evidence. Transformation, however, comes at a cost. Once knowledge enters the legal domain, it is reshaped. It is categorized. It is filtered through legal language. Emotional truth may be flattened. Context may be stripped away. What remains is what the court can use. For witnesses, this process can feel like another loss of control. Their suffering is no longer theirs. Their story is no longer told on their terms. Their words are repurposed to serve institutional goals. Yet for many, this repurposing is still preferable to silence, because silence offered no protection at all. The moment when rumor breaks into record is therefore deeply ambivalent. It brings hope of intervention, but it also exposes witnesses to new forms of vulnerability, scrutiny, disbelief, retaliation if protection falters. This is why state backing is crucial. Without backing from the highest level, witnesses could be punished once attention faded. With backing, the balance of fear shifts, at least temporarily. Those who had been untouchable become subject to questioning. Those who had been silent become valuable sources of information. In Saltykova's case, imperial backing changed the calculus. It did not erase fear, but it made speech possible. It signaled that the estate's private authority had limits. It created a space, narrow and fragile, in which rumor could become testimony. Chapter 9, When the State Finally Listens. A closed system does not open because it becomes morally unbearable. It opens because something changes outside it. In Saltykova's case, that change was not simply the accumulation of suffering on her estates, though that suffering was the moral center of the story. The change was political. It was administrative. It was the moment when private violence became legible as a public problem the state could usefully address. This is the hardest truth of the chapter, that attention from above is often not triggered by harm alone, but by the conditions that make harm inconvenient to ignore. By the early 1760s, the Russian Empire was under new rule. Catherine II had come to the throne in 1762, and her legitimacy was not a settled fact. She inherited a system that depended on noble cooperation and a society in which the nobility expected to govern their estates with minimal interference. At the same time, Catherine cultivated an image of rational governance, of order and of lawfulness, not necessarily as lived reality for all people, but as a political language that stabilized authority. This language mattered. A ruler who claims to govern by reason and law must sometimes demonstrate that claim. The demonstration does not need to be consistent. It needs to be visible. It needs to be striking enough that it can circulate as proof of sovereign capacity. Saltykova's case offered precisely that opportunity. It involved a noble landowner, which made it dramatic. It involved serfs, which made it containable. It involved repeated harm, which made it morally shocking. It involved petitions, which meant the state could frame intervention as responding to appeal rather than intruding arbitrarily. Most importantly, it allowed Catherine to do something politically useful, to assert that noble privilege was not absolute, without threatening the system of noble privilege itself. That balance is the key. If Catherine had attempted to challenge the broader structure of estate power, she would have risked alienating the very class on which imperial governance depended. If she did nothing, she risked appearing indifferent to suffering and weak in the face of elite abuse, a dangerous look for a ruler consolidating power. Acting against one individual noblewoman offered a controlled solution. It created an example without creating a revolution. The petitions that reached Catherine were therefore not simply read as stories of suffering. They were read as problems of governance. A landowner who caused repeated deaths on her estates was not only cruel. She was destabilizing. She created disorder, fear, and potential unrest. She produced a kind of scandal that could damage the state's appearance of order, especially if it became widely discussed. A state cannot tolerate the idea that private sovereignty is stronger than public authority. Serfdom already blurred the boundary between private and public power by granting landowners enormous control. Yet the empire still needed to claim final jurisdiction. It needed to be able to say, the estate is yours, but only within limits, and those limits are set by the throne. This is why the decision to intervene was ultimately an assertion of sovereignty. Once Catherine's attention fixed, the case could be reframed in official terms. Not merely as a private grievance. Not merely as local conflict, but as a breach that required imperial correction. That reframing changed everything. It changed what officials could do without fear of retaliation from noble networks. It changed what witnesses could say without immediate punishment. It changed what had previously been rumor into something that could be called testimony. It also changed the psychological climate on the estate. The sense that the mistress was untouchable could finally be disturbed. The first visible sign of disturbance was the state's willingness to act against her person. Arrest, in cases involving the nobility, was not automatic. It required confidence that the state could carry the action through. To move against a landowner was to invite counterpressure, petitions from relatives, appeals to patrons, influence through local officials. The state had to be prepared to hold its position, not simply gesture. Imperial backing provided that grip. When the state finally listened, it did so in a way designed to be unmistakable. The aim was not only to investigate but to demonstrate that investigation was possible. The estate, long treated as a private domain, became penetrable. This penetration was not gentle. An investigation into estate cruelty required the state to do something estates were structured to resist, to take the words of serfs seriously enough to put them into official record. That act, in itself, was destabilizing. It suggested that the voices at the bottom could, under certain conditions, travel upward and matter. The conditions, however, were strict. The serfs were not suddenly granted rights. They were granted usefulness. Their testimony mattered because it served a state project, to establish the truth of an extraordinary case and to craft a punishment that would reinforce imperial authority. Their voices were heard through the ear of power, and what was heard was shaped by what power needed. This is not cynicism. It is description. States do not move like individuals. They move through interest, legitimacy, and the management of order. Once the state decided to move, it faced practical challenges that revealed just how close the estate had been. It had to identify witnesses who were willing to speak. It had to separate those witnesses from immediate retaliation. It had to gather accounts that could withstand official scrutiny. It had to decide which deaths could be proven and which could only be suspected. It had to navigate the problem of scale. Too small and the case would not justify extraordinary action. Too large and it would threaten the image of noble governance more broadly. The investigation thus required selection and containment even as it claimed to reveal. Containment shaped the narrative from the beginning. A public case needed a coherent center. The center became Saltykova herself. Her name allowed the state to attach disorder to one individual rather than to the system. Her punishment could then be presented as resolution. This is why listening is not the same as justice. Listening brings intervention. Intervention brings procedure. Procedure brings narrative. Narrative brings punishment. Punishment brings closure, for the state. What it does not necessarily bring is reform. The people on the estate may have hoped for safety. They may have hoped for relief. They may have hoped that the removal of one figure would change the climate of violence. Some of that hope may have been justified in the short term. Yet the broader structure of serfdom remained. The state was not preparing to dismantle private authority over serfs. It was preparing to demonstrate that private authority could be punished when it threatened public legitimacy. Even the fact that Saltykova was a woman is part of this political usefulness. A noblewoman could be punished in a way that carried moral theater, the shock of female cruelty, the betrayal of domestic virtue, the inversion of expected femininity. This theater made the case more discussable, more memorable, and more effective as a public example. At the same time, punishing a woman could sometimes avoid direct confrontation with male noble networks in the same way punishing a prominent man might have done, depending on alliances and patronage. Gender, here, becomes part of legibility. The state can more easily frame a woman's violence as aberration than it can frame a male landowner's violence as aberration, because male force is already embedded in the normal logic of estate discipline. A woman's excess becomes monstrous more readily in cultural imagination, and monstrosity is useful when you want an example to circulate. This does not mean Catherine acted because Saltykova was a woman. It means the case gained rhetorical strength through gendered expectations that were already in place. Once listening became action, time also shifted. For years, the estate had operated on slow time, repetitive days, punishments absorbed into routine, petitions moving at a crawl or failing entirely. State action introduced official time, dates, documents, interrogations, recorded statements, steps in a process. The case became something that could be measured, tracked, and controlled. Control was the point. The state did not intervene simply to stop harm. It intervened to demonstrate that it could stop harm when it chose to. It reasserted the principle that sovereignty rested with the throne, not with any individual landowner, no matter how insulated. Chapter 10: Arrest and Shock. Arrest is not only a legal act. In a closed system, it is an event that changes reality. For years, the estate had functioned as if Saltykova's authority was final. Orders were given, punishments carried out, silence maintained. Even when fear was constant, the structure of fear was stable, power flowed downward, and consequences flowed downward with it. The possibility that power might be interrupted from above existed in theory, but in lived experience it remained distant. When the state finally moved against Saltykova, it ruptured that lived experience. Later accounts commonly place her arrest in 1762, following petitions that reached Catherine II. The date matters less than the significance of the act. A noblewoman who had been shielded by rank was now treated as a subject of investigation. The estate's private sovereignty was breached. A figure experienced as untouchable was touched. For those living under her authority, this would not have felt like the arrival of simple justice. It would have felt like destabilization. Closed systems depend on predictability. Even terror becomes predictable when it follows known patterns. People learn the rhythms of fear. They learn when danger tends to peak, where it tends to occur, how to behave to reduce risk. They are not safe, but they are oriented. Orientation is a form of survival. Arrest destroys orientation. Suddenly, the old rules no longer hold. The mistress may be removed. The household hierarchy may collapse. Loyal subordinates may scramble. Overseers may become uncertain. Servants who participated in enforcement may fear punishment themselves. Those who suffered may fear that the arrest is temporary and that retaliation will follow. In the first moments of such a rupture, fear does not disappear. It multiplies. There is also shock. Shock is not only emotional. It is social. It changes what people imagine is possible. In an estate context, the idea that the state could intervene against a noble landowner might have felt almost unreal, particularly for serfs who had seen petitions fail and complainants punished. If intervention finally came, it did not automatically produce trust. It produced uncertainty. Is this real, and will it last? This question shapes everything that follows. Arrest in a noble case also triggers immediate political responses. A noble family does not accept humiliation quietly. It mobilizes networks. It seeks patrons. It attempts to shift blame, reduce charges, or reframe the case. Even if the state is determined, these pressures exist. They influence the process by slowing it, redirecting it, and forcing authorities to demonstrate resolve. The length of Saltykova's investigation and trial process reflects this complexity. A case involving a powerful family is never merely a local prosecution. It becomes an assertion of authority against a social class that expects deference. The state therefore had to manage two audiences at once. The serfs and local community needed to see that intervention was real. The nobility needed to see that intervention was exceptional and controlled, not a general threat to their privileges. Balancing these audiences required careful choreography. This is why the state's actions were likely deliberate and symbolic. Removing Saltykova from her domain signaled that the domain was not fully sovereign. It also signaled that the state could reach into private authority when it chose. At the same time, the state needed to avoid making this reach seem like a new norm. That tension runs through the whole case. Arrest also changes what can be said. Before arrest, speaking was dangerous because the landowner could punish. After arrest, speaking becomes possible, but only within a new set of dangers. Witnesses must now speak to officials who may not protect them long term. They must speak in a way that the state can use. They must translate lived experience into the language of evidence. They must risk being disbelieved or dismissed. The state does not simply collect truth. It selects and formats it. For serfs, this is an unfamiliar demand. Their daily lives were not lived in the language of legal record. They lived in immediate sensations: hunger, fatigue, fear, injury. To be asked to recount details, sequences, names, and times is to be pulled into an administrative world that does not naturally fit their experience. This mismatch affects testimony. Witnesses may speak in fragments. They may give inconsistent timelines. They may emphasize what felt most terrifying rather than what is most evidential. They may understate or overstate, depending on fear and expectation. None of this means they are lying. It means they are speaking from within a survival-shaped memory. Arrest also triggers a scramble among those who served the landowner. Estate staff, overseers, and senior servants who enforce discipline may fear that the investigation will extend to them. They may attempt to protect themselves by minimizing their involvement or by placing blame upward. Others may attempt to protect the landowner by suppressing evidence, intimidating witnesses, or offering alternative explanations. This struggle is part of the estate's internal politics. Not all servants are aligned. Not all overseers are loyal. Some may have suffered under the landowner as well, though in different ways. Some may see opportunity in the collapse of authority. Some may act out of genuine fear. In closed systems, people learn to survive by aligning with power. When power shifts, alignment becomes urgent. The arrest, therefore, does not simply remove one person. It destabilizes a network. This network includes not only the estate but the local environment around it. Neighbors, clerics, minor officials, and townspeople who had previously been cautious may now speak more freely. The social tone changes. What was once whispered becomes discussable. Yet even this discussion remains shaped by rank. People may still hesitate to speak too boldly, uncertain how far the states will extend. Uncertainty creates a peculiar atmosphere, a mixture of relief, fear, and opportunism. Relief that the unthinkable has occurred. Fear that it may be reversed. Opportunism as individuals attempt to protect themselves or gain advantage. In such an atmosphere, truth and strategy can intertwine. This is why investigations must be read as social processes, not purely factual ones. The state's investigators had to navigate this atmosphere. They had to decide whom to believe. They had to decide what could be proven. They had to decide which deaths were clearly linked to abuse and which would remain suspected. They had to decide how to handle a case that, if fully expanded, could reveal not only one noblewoman's cruelty but the broader brutality permitted by serfdom. This last point is crucial. A full, unrestrained investigation into estate violence might have uncovered patterns that were not unique to Saltykova. It might have raised uncomfortable questions about what other landowners did quietly. The state did not want those questions. It wanted a contained scandal, one extraordinary case that could be punished as exception. Containment required careful management of numbers and charges. This is why later accounts often present two sets of figures, the number of deaths discussed or alleged, and the number of deaths for which conviction was secured. The gap is not merely evidentiary. It is also political. Convicting a noblewoman for a smaller provable number allowed the state to punish decisively without implying that similar violence was widespread and tolerated. Even so, the conviction count itself was extraordinary. Extraordinary counts were precisely what made the case so useful. They justified the state's dramatic intervention. They allowed Catherine to present herself as capable of controlling noble excess. They created a story that could circulate as proof of imperial justice. Arrest, then, is the hinge between two kinds of narrative. Before arrest, the estate story, fear, routine, containment. After arrest, the state story, evidence, procedure, and example. The hinge does not remove the estate story. It translates it, imperfectly, into a form that the state can use. Chapter 11, Testimony under Constraint. When the state intervenes in a closed system, it does not encounter truth in its natural form. It encounters fragments shaped by fear, memory, and survival. The investigation into Saltykova's conduct required testimony from people who had lived for years under conditions that punished speech. This alone made the process fragile. Testimony did not emerge from a position of safety or confidence. It emerged from bodies and minds trained to calculate risk, to minimize exposure, and to survive authority rather than to challenge it. This context matters because it explains both the power and the limits of the evidence that followed. Serfs were not accustomed to being asked for their accounts. When they were asked, it was usually to confirm obligations, report labor, or receive discipline. Being asked to describe abuse, particularly abuse committed by a noble landowner, reversed the usual direction of questioning. That reversal did not erase years of conditioning. Witnesses spoke carefully. They measured their words. They avoided speculation. They focused on what they believed could be proven. Some accounts were spare. Others were repetitive. Many focused on patterns rather than on singular events, because pattern was what they had lived with. Yet legal systems are uneasy with pattern unless it can be broken into discrete acts. Courts want dates, locations, sequences. They want to attach responsibility to specific moments. This mismatch creates tension. A witness might say, "It happened many times." The court asks, "Which time?" A witness might say, "She was often punished." The court asks, "On what date?" A witness might say, "She became weak and died." The court asks, "From what cause?" These questions are not unreasonable within legal logic, but they can be nearly impossible to answer when abuse was repetitive, when time blurred under fear, and when illness and punishment were entangled. The investigative process therefore required translation. Officials had to translate lived experience into legal categories. They had to decide which testimonies could be corroborated, which deaths could be connected to specific acts, and which accounts would remain suggestive rather than actionable. This process did not only shape the case. It shaped the historical record. What survives as fact is often what the court could process, not necessarily what was most representative of the harm endured. What could not be neatly categorized might be set aside, not because it was untrue, but because it did not fit the requirements of proof. This is one reason victim counts vary so widely in later retellings. Some sources cite numbers discussed during investigation. Others cite numbers secured in conviction. Still others inflate numbers to reflect moral outrage rather than legal certainty. Each approach reflects a different relationship to evidence. The court's relationship was conservative by necessity. To punish a noblewoman, it needed to build a case that could withstand elite scrutiny. Overreach risked backlash. Underreach risked appearing weak. The solution was to prosecute what could be firmly established while acknowledging, implicitly if not explicitly, that the full scope of harm might never be known. Witnesses were also constrained by memory shaped through trauma. Trauma does not preserve events in clean sequences. It fragments. It intensifies some details while erasing others. It prioritizes survival-relevant information over chronology. This does not make testimony unreliable in a moral sense. It makes it uneven in a legal one. Courts often treat inconsistency as evidence of deceit. In cases like this, Inconsistency is often evidence of long-term exposure to fear. A witness who hesitates may not be lying. A witness who contradicts herself may be struggling to reconcile memory and expectation. A witness who changes details may be responding to cues about what the court wants to hear. These dynamics are not failures of character. They are features of constrained testimony. The presence of authority in the interrogation room also matters. Serfs testifying against a former mistress were still speaking to representatives of the same class that had long controlled their lives. Even if those representatives were acting under imperial mandate, the imbalance of power remained visible. Witnesses had reason to fear saying too much, saying the wrong thing, or implicating themselves in ways they did not understand. Fear shapes speech subtly. It produces understatement. It produces caution. It produces a tendency to stick to what feels safe. Safe testimony is often limited testimony. The court also had to contend with mediation. Testimony may have been recorded by clerks who translated oral accounts into written form. This translation process could flatten emotion, remove context, or alter emphasis. The voice that survives in record is not always the voice that spoke. This is not unique to Saltykova's case. It is a general problem in historical justice. But it is particularly acute here because the witnesses were not fluent participants in legal culture. Their words passed through filters before they became evidence. At the same time, testimony accumulated. No single account carried the case. What carried it was repetition across witnesses. Similar descriptions of punishment. Similar trajectories of decline. Similar fears expressed independently. Pattern began to outweigh precision. Pattern is persuasive when it emerges without coordination. This is why the investigation did not collapse under inconsistency. It gained strength from convergence. Where witnesses agreed on forms of punishment, on the atmosphere of fear, on the vulnerability of certain workers, the court could infer a stable environment of abuse even when individual details varied. Inference, however, is always politically sensitive. To infer too much would imply that similar environments existed elsewhere. To infer too little would undermine the case's moral force. The investigators therefore walked a narrow path, presenting Saltykova's actions as extreme while implicitly preserving the legitimacy of state governance more broadly. This balancing act is visible in the way the court approached numbers. Rather than claiming to account for every death associated with her authority, the court focused on those it could link with sufficient confidence. Other deaths were acknowledged but left legally unresolved. This created a gap between legal truth and lived truth. That gap remains in historical memory. It is tempting to fill it with speculation or sensationalism. This book does not. Instead, it treats the gap as evidence of constraint. It marks the boundary of what could be safely said and proven at the time. Testimony under constraint does not deliver total truth. It delivers enough truth to move the system. In Saltykova's case, it delivered enough to justify extraordinary punishment. It delivered enough to make her name synonymous with abuse. It delivered enough to allow Catherine II to stage a demonstration of imperial justice. What it did not deliver was a reckoning with the system that had allowed the abuse to persist. That reckoning was never the court's task. Chapter 12, Catherine's Justice. When a sovereign punishes a noble, the act is never only about the crime. It is about the boundary of power. Catherine II's handling of Saltykova's case has often been framed as evidence of enlightened justice, the ruler who would not tolerate cruelty, the empress who listened to petitions, the state that finally intervened on behalf of the powerless. This framing contains a truth. Intervention did occur, and it was extraordinary in a system designed to shield landowners. Yet the framing is incomplete. Catherine's justice was not only moral. It was political. The punishment had to accomplish several things at once. It had to affirm that the state could control noble excess. It had to reassure the public that order still held. It had to demonstrate Catherine's authority as legitimate and rational. It had to avoid threatening the broader institution of noble estate power. This combination produced a justice that was carefully calibrated. Saltykova was not treated like an ordinary criminal. She could not be. She was a noblewoman, embedded in a class whose cooperation the state depended on. To execute her would have been a dramatic statement, perhaps too dramatic. Execution might have implied that noble violence was not merely aberrant but incompatible with the state's moral claims. It might have invited uncomfortable questions about how many other estates operated under similar brutality. It might have created fear among nobles that the state could turn on them. Catherine needed a punishment that was severe, unmistakable, and symbolic, but contained. Life imprisonment achieved this containment. It removed Saltykova from her domain permanently. It prevented her return to private sovereignty. It allowed the state to claim moral action without escalating into revolutionary threat. The method of imprisonment is also revealing. Confinement in a convent, often described in later accounts as the Ivanovsky convent in Moscow, linked punishment to moral correction and religious seclusion rather than to purely secular execution. This form of punishment allowed the state to present itself as both firm and civilized. It also avoided the spectacle of blood. Catherine's public image included a commitment to rational governance and a distaste, at least rhetorically, for cruelty as public performance. Yet rhetoric does not mean softness. In Saltykova's case, public humiliation was still used, but in a controlled way. Later retellings commonly include a scene in which Saltykova was displayed publicly for a set period, chained, with a sign describing her crimes, before being taken into confinement. Whether every detail of this display is preserved consistently across sources, the broader purpose is clear: the state wanted the punishment to be seen. Seen, but not uncontrolled. A public display functions as a kind of theater. It announces that the sovereign has judged. It marks the condemned as outside acceptable order. It allows the crowd to witness state power without participating in violence. This kind of theater is especially useful in cases that have circulated as rumor. The public wants confirmation that what it has heard is real. The state wants the public to see that it is capable of acting. The display becomes proof, not proof of the crime, but proof of sovereignty. For Catherine, sovereignty was not an abstract principle. It was an ongoing project. Her rise to power involved political upheaval. To stabilize her position, she needed to demonstrate control. Control could be shown through reform rhetoric, administrative projects, and patronage. But control could also be shown through targeted examples, moments when the state intervened decisively to correct disorder. Saltykova's case offered an ideal example because it was both extraordinary and containable. Extraordinary, because it involved a noblewoman accused of repeated brutality. Containable, because it could be framed as one exceptional individual rather than as systemic pattern. The state could therefore claim moral superiority without undermining the nobility as a whole. This framing required careful narrative construction. The court and state apparatus emphasized Saltykova's acts as excessive, aberrant, beyond tolerable discipline. In doing so, they implicitly protected the broader practice of estate discipline by defining a boundary. Ordinary punishment is permitted, but this was too far. The boundary served the state. It allowed Catherine to claim she was not challenging noble authority in general, only policing its extremes. This is a classic strategy of power: preserve the structure, punish the deviation, strengthen legitimacy. Yet from the perspective of serfs, the boundary may have felt arbitrary. Serfs endured routine violence that was never prosecuted. They lived under a system that treated their bodies as punishable. The state did not intervene for them in ordinary cases. It intervened here because the case became politically useful and morally spectacular enough to justify attention. This does not erase the significance of intervention. It contextualizes it. Catherine's justice, then, must be read as a statement to multiple audiences. To the serfs, the sovereign can hear you sometimes. To local officials, noble immunity has limits when the throne decides. To the nobility, the state will punish extremes, but it is not coming for the system itself. To the public, Catherine rules with law, not chaos. The punishment's symbolic nature also shaped how Saltykova entered memory. By humiliating her publicly and confining her for life, the state transformed her into a cautionary figure. She became a living sign of what happens when private authority becomes publicly embarrassing. The message was not serfdom is dangerous. The message was noble cruelty can be punished when it exceeds acceptable bounds. This distinction is subtle, but crucial. It explains why the case did not lead to broad reform. It explains why serfdom continued for another century. It explains why private estate violence remained, for most victims, beyond legal reach. Saltykova's punishment also protected something else: lineage. Many accounts note that she had sons, and the continuation of family line and property was a central concern for noble society. Punishing her did not necessarily mean destroying the family entirely. The state could remove her without dismantling the Saltykova network. In doing so, it reinforced the idea that punishment could be personal rather than structural. Personal punishment is politically convenient. It reassures the elite that the class remains intact. It reassures the public that justice has been done. It allows the state to demonstrate power while preserving the system that supports it. This is why Catherine's justice can be simultaneously real and limited. Real, because it removed and condemned a noblewoman who had been protected for years. Limited, because it did not challenge the conditions that made her power possible. Chapter 13. Life imprisonment. Execution ends a life. Imprisonment turns a life into a lesson. When Saltykova was sentenced to lifelong confinement, the state did more than remove her from society. It transformed her into a contained symbol, a person who would remain present in the imagination but absent from power. This form of punishment was particularly suited to Catherine II's aims. It demonstrated authority without the finality of public killing. It preserved the state's image as rational and controlled while still communicating that noble privilege had limits. Yet lifelong imprisonment also raises a question that haunts the entire case. What does justice mean in a system where ordinary cruelty remains lawful? Saltykova's confinement is often described as taking place at the Ivanovsky convent in Moscow. Later retellings sometimes emphasize a progression, an initial period of harsher confinement, followed by less severe conditions later. The precise details vary across accounts and are not always presented with consistent documentation in popular summaries. What can be stated with confidence is the overall shape: removal from estate life, long-term seclusion, and death in confinement in 1801. This shape matters because it shows what the state wanted from punishment. The goal was not rehabilitation. The goal was not correction. The goal was containment. Containment has two dimensions: physical and narrative. Physical containment prevented Saltykova from exercising authority over serfs again. It stopped the flow of orders, punishments, and fear that had structured life on her estates. The estate would continue, but the center of that particular closed system had been cut out. Narrative containment is subtler. A case like Saltykova's threatens the legitimacy of the broader social order because it reveals that private power can become extreme. The state must therefore contain not only the perpetrator but the meaning of the case. Lifelong imprisonment helps do this. It keeps the figure available as proof of the state's authority while preventing ongoing scandal. A living prisoner cannot defend herself publicly, cannot circulate in society, cannot provoke further rumors through continued presence in elite circles. She becomes silent by design. Silence is one of the state's most useful tools. In death, a figure can become myth. In life imprisonment, a figure becomes controlled myth. She exists, but only within the state's chosen boundaries. People can talk about her, but she cannot speak back. This asymmetry shapes memory. It also shapes how violence is processed. The public humiliation and subsequent confinement create a moral arc: accusation, judgment, degradation, removal. The arc reassures society that disorder has been addressed. Yet it also closes discussion prematurely. The narrative becomes one woman was monstrous, rather than this system creates conditions where monstrosity can persist. The prison, then, functions as a closing device. For the serfs who had petitioned, imprisonment likely carried mixed meaning. On one hand, it was proof that petitions could, under rare conditions, succeed. It was confirmation that the mistress's authority was not absolute. It may have brought immediate relief, fear shifting away, punishments reduced or redirected, the possibility of a less brutal regime. On the other hand, it did not erase the reality that serfdom continued. The estate still existed. Serfs still belonged to land. Discipline still remained legally permitted. Local authority still remained insulated. The removal of one landowner did not transform the structure. It shifted the particular climate of one domain. That shift matters, but it does not represent justice in the modern sense. This is one of the book's recurring tensions, the difference between relief and reform. Lifelong imprisonment is relief for those directly harmed by the prisoner's continued power. It is not reform for those who remain within the system that enabled that power. The convent itself carries symbolic weight. Convents were associated with moral order, discipline, and seclusion. For a noblewoman, confinement in a convent also carried a gendered logic. It framed punishment within the language of feminine moral failure and correction. It suggested that her crime was not only against people but against expected womanhood, the mistress who should have embodied order instead embodied terror. This framing made the punishment culturally legible. It also allowed the state to position itself as restoring not only legal order but moral and social order. The convent becomes a place where the aberrant woman is put away, not simply punished. Putting away is an act of control. It removes a threat while preserving the appearance of stability. It also discourages deeper inquiry. A figure locked away is easier to treat as anomaly. If she had been publicly executed, the spectacle might have provoked wider debate. Lifelong confinement allows the scandal to be managed more quietly after the initial demonstration. Quiet management is often the state's preference. The long duration of Saltykova's confinement also created a strange temporal effect. The case did not end quickly in lived memory. People knew she remained alive. She existed as a rumor that could be pointed to, she is still there. This ongoing existence reinforced the idea of state authority as continuing rather than momentary. The state did not simply punish and forget, it held the offender in permanent custody. Permanent custody is itself a message. Yet the message is double-edged. It says, the sovereign can punish even nobles. It also says, punishment is exceptional and individual. The second part is implicit, but it is crucial. If the state wanted to admit that a state cruelty was widespread, it would have needed broader intervention. Instead, it treated Saltykova as a singular case. Her lifelong confinement reinforced this singularity by removing the need for continued public action. She became the example. Other estates remained private. There is also the matter of what imprisonment does to the historical record. Once Saltykova was confined, the archive thickens around the state's actions and thins around her person. She disappears into institutional space. Later writers fill that disappearance with speculation, her daily life in confinement, her temperament, her remorse or lack of it. This book does not. It treats her imprisonment as the continuation of a political story rather than an opportunity for invented interior scenes. What we can reliably say is that the state removed her from power and kept her there. What we cannot reliably say is what she thought day to day, or how she interpreted her punishment. Without primary personal writings, such claims would be narrative indulgence. The death of Saltykova in 1801 marks the end of her physical story. It does not mark the end of her symbolic story. Chapter 14, Death Without Closure. Darya Saltykova died in confinement in 1801. The system that made her power possible did not die with her. This chapter is not concerned with the final biological details of her death, which are not preserved in a way that offers meaningful insight beyond the fact of her continued confinement and eventual end. It is concerned with what death did to the case, and more importantly, what death did not do. Death is often mistaken for closure. In moral storytelling, the death of the condemned allows the reader to feel that the account has reached its proper end. The offender has been removed, the world has been corrected, the narrative has resolved. Historical reality rarely offers such neatness. In Saltykova's case, the offender's death marked the end of her capacity to serve as a living symbol of state power. It did not mark the end of a state sovereignty. It did not undo the conditions that produced the violence. It did not restore the lives lost. It simply ended the state's custodianship of one person. If Catherine's justice was designed as a controlled spectacle, Saltykova's death happened beyond spectacle. It did not require a public act. It did not provide the state with a new demonstration. In fact, the state had already gained what it needed from her case decades earlier, a narrative of intervention, punishment, and restraint that reinforced the idea of imperial authority. After that, the system could return to its preferred condition, quiet. Quiet is the natural state of closed systems. Even when harm continues, the system prefers it to remain local, private, and manageable. Scandal is disruptive. Scandal attracts attention. Attention risks questions. Questions risk reform. Reform was not what the state wanted. The most important fact following Saltykova's death is that serfdom persisted. The system that made serfs legally vulnerable remained intact until the 19th century's later reforms. The private sovereignty of landowners remained central to Russian social and economic life. Violence continued in many forms across estates, not necessarily in the same scale or intensity as Saltykova's case, but within the same permissive framework. This continuity reveals the core function of her case. It functioned as boundary enforcement, not transformation. A boundary enforcement case works like this. An extreme example emerges that threatens legitimacy. The state intervenes to punish the example. The state defines the behavior as aberrant. The state preserves the broader structure by implying that ordinary practice is acceptable. Saltykova's case fits this pattern precisely. The state's intervention communicated that noble cruelty had limits, but it did not redefine the fundamental relationship between landowners and serfs. If anything, it reinforced that relationship by portraying it as usually orderly and only rarely corrupted. This is where the language of exception becomes politically powerful. By presenting Saltykova as exceptional, the state could reassure the nobility that their privileges were secure. It could reassure the public that the sovereign was capable of moral correction. It could avoid admitting that the very arrangement of estate power contained violence as an ordinary feature. The cost of this reassurance was paid by the powerless, as it always is. The victims of Saltykova's estates did not receive restoration. Their families did not receive systemic protection. The case's visibility may have offered some immediate relief on her estates, but the broader world remained one in which serf suffering was beneath the threshold of regular state concern. Even the act of petitioning, which in this case was ultimately successful, remained risky for others. A rare victory does not transform a system. It can even reinforce it by creating the illusion that justice is available, when in fact it is available only under very narrow, politically useful conditions. This is why the death of Saltykova does not close the book. It forces a reorientation. Instead of asking, how did she end, we must ask, what did her case do? It did several things. It demonstrated that the sovereign could intervene against noble excess. It produced a cautionary symbol that circulated through culture. It reinforced the boundary between acceptable estate discipline and unacceptable scandal. It created a narrative of Catherine's authority that supported her legitimacy. It allowed the system to continue largely unchanged. From the state's perspective, that is successful governance. From the perspective of justice as we might wish it, it is a limited victory. Saltykova's death also changed how her story could be told. While she lived in confinement, she remained a controlled symbol, present but silent, useful as proof of state custody. After death, she became available to myth-making in a different way. Without the constraints of a living prisoner, retellers could exaggerate, moralize, and psychologize freely. Death frees narrative. It also frees distortion. This is why Saltykova's afterlife intensifies after her physical end. Her story becomes less about the estate system and more about the monstrous noblewoman. The focus shifts toward personality, depravity, and Gothic shock. Victims become numbers. Serfdom becomes scenery. The state becomes heroic. Catherine becomes the enlightened ruler. The complexity of political usefulness disappears behind moral drama. This transformation is not simply the failure of later writers. It reflects cultural appetite. Cultures prefer monsters to systems because monsters can be removed. Systems implicate everyone who benefits from them. Saltykova as monster is comforting. Saltykova as product of private sovereignty is not. To write responsibly about her case, we must resist the comfort. We must recognize that the truly disturbing aspect is not the idea that one individual could be extraordinarily cruel. It is the idea that she could be extraordinarily cruel for so long within a structure designed to protect her. Death, then, is not closure. It is the moment when the state's example fades and society is left with its own arrangements again. Chapter 15: Myth, Monster, and Noble Exception. Once Saltykova was no longer alive to be contained by the state, her story entered a different kind of custody: cultural memory. Cultural memory does not preserve complexity. It preserves what is useful, repeatable, and emotionally satisfying. In Saltykova's case, what proved most durable was not the structure of serfdom or the mechanics of estate power, but the figure of the monstrous noblewoman. Over time, she became less a product of a system and more an embodiment of evil within it. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, as legal records gave way to retellings, and retellings gave way to legend. Early accounts retained some institutional detail. They noted petitions, investigations, imperial involvement. But as the case moved further from living memory, these details thinned. What remained were the elements that provoked fascination and moral certainty: cruelty, excess, and the violation of expected femininity. Saltykova became a story about what a woman should not be. She was cast as unnatural. She was described as inhuman. She was framed as a moral aberration rather than a political problem. This framing served several purposes at once. It satisfied a cultural appetite for clear villains. It allowed readers to distance themselves from the conditions that enabled the violence. It protected the broader institution of noble authority by isolating guilt in one figure. In this sense, myth-making did not distort the truth accidentally. It performed cultural work. One of the most striking features of Saltykova's mythologization is the inflation of numbers. Later retellings often cite dramatically high victim counts, sometimes presented without qualification. These figures circulate widely because they shock. Shock draws attention. Attention reinforces notoriety. Yet the focus on numbers alone reduces the story to a contest of magnitude. How bad was she? Magnitude, however, is not explanation. Whether the number of victims was dozens or more, the central question remains the same: how could repeated harm occur within a legal system that claimed order? Inflating numbers may increase horror, but it also shifts focus away from mechanism. It invites readers to see the case as extraordinary beyond comprehension, rather than as extreme but instructive. The monstrous framing also leans heavily on gender. A violent nobleman can be folded into narratives of tyranny or brutality without threatening gender norms. A violent noblewoman disrupts those norms. Her violence must be explained not simply as abuse of power, but as a violation of femininity itself. This is where language becomes revealing. She is described as unnatural. She is likened to beasts or demons. Her womanhood is treated as corrupted. These descriptions do more than condemn. They reassure. They suggest that such violence could only arise from a woman who failed to be a woman properly. The implication is that ordinary women, even ordinary noblewomen, are not implicated. This reassurance is politically convenient. It allows the culture to condemn Saltykova without examining how noblewomen were trained in authority, how domestic power was normalized, and how cruelty could be framed as discipline within accepted roles. By treating her as exception, the system avoids scrutiny. The same logic applies to class. Saltykova is remembered not as a representative of noble estate power, but as its betrayal. Her cruelty is framed as an anomaly within an otherwise functional hierarchy. This framing allows noble authority to remain legitimate by comparison. She was too cruel, too excessive, too far beyond the line. Yet the line itself is rarely examined. What level of punishment was considered acceptable? What suffering was routine and ignored? How many deaths were considered normal under labor conditions? These questions are uncomfortable because they blur the boundary between ordinary governance and extraordinary cruelty. Myth-making resolves this discomfort by simplifying. In the mythic version of Saltykova, there is no system. There is only a monster. This monster absorbs attention. It becomes a warning tale. It becomes entertainment. It becomes a moral lesson stripped of politics. The estate disappears. Serfdom fades into backdrop. The state's selective intervention becomes heroic rather than strategic. This simplification has consequences. It distorts how we understand violence in hierarchical systems. It encourages us to look for extreme personalities rather than permissive structures. It suggests that preventing harm is a matter of identifying bad individuals rather than limiting unchecked authority. It also distorts how we understand female power. Saltykova's case is often used to imply that women wield power dangerously when allowed too much of it. This implication feeds into broader anxieties about female authority, rather than prompting examination of how any authority, male or female, behaves when insulated from oversight. The focus on her gender thus becomes a distraction. The truly unusual aspect of her case is not that she was a woman with power. It is that she held power without accountability in a system designed to protect that condition. This is where the myth of exception does its deepest work. By presenting Saltykova as uniquely monstrous, the culture absolves itself of responsibility. The system that produced her remains intact, invisible, and unchallenged. The narrative closes comfortably. The monster is punished, order is restored, the lesson is learned. But the lesson is false. What Saltykova's case actually teaches is not that extreme cruelty is rare, but that it is rarely punished. It teaches that harm persists most easily where authority is private, where labor is coerced, and where those harmed lack voice. It teaches that justice, when it comes, is often shaped by political usefulness rather than by moral urgency. This chapter does not argue that Saltykova should be rehabilitated or reinterpreted sympathetically. It argues that focusing on her as monster alone impoverishes our understanding. It reduces a systemic failure to a personal horror. The cost of that reduction is paid repeatedly, in different contexts, whenever institutions respond to abuse by removing individuals without altering structures. Chapter 16: Gender and Power Without Sentiment. There is a particular kind of fascination that attaches to women who commit extreme harm. It is not neutral. It is shaped by expectation. In most societies, including 18th century Russia, women were culturally positioned as guardians of domestic order, keepers of household morality, managers of care, symbols of restraint. Even when women held real authority within private spaces, that authority was often framed as natural rather than political, as an extension of feminine duty rather than as power in its own right. When a woman's actions violate that framing, the response is rarely measured. It becomes moral theater. Darya Saltykova's case sits inside this dynamic. Her notoriety has never been explained solely by the scale of harm. It has been fueled by the shock of a noble woman exercising violence so relentlessly. The question that follows in many retellings is not simply, how could a landowner do this? But how could a woman do this? This question reveals more about the culture asking it than about Saltykova herself. It implies that women's violence is less expected and therefore more disturbing. It implies that female authority is somehow more suspicious when it departs from caretaking roles. It implies that women who harm must be explained in special terms, as aberrant, unnatural, monstrous. These explanations are often emotionally satisfying. They are also intellectually lazy. They allow us to treat female harm as an anomaly rather than as an expression of power operating under particular conditions. They encourage us to look for individual pathology instead of examining the structures that made harm possible. This book refuses that approach. It does not sentimentalize Saltykova as a misunderstood woman shaped by grief or trauma. It does not excuse her actions. It also does not treat her as proof that female power is inherently dangerous. It treats her as a figure who exercised authority within a violent system and whose gender shaped how that authority was perceived, prosecuted, and remembered. To speak of gender in this case is to speak of framing. Gender shaped the roles available to Saltykova. Gender shaped the expectations attached to those roles. Gender shaped the scandal produced when those expectations were violated. But gender did not create the estate system. Class did. In many ways, class is the more decisive axis. A noblewoman had power because she belonged to the nobility. A serf suffered because she was a serf. Gender operated inside that hierarchy, not outside it. The most vulnerable people on Saltykova's estates were often young women, but their vulnerability was produced by both gender and status. They were female and bound, close to domestic power and without legal voice. Saltykova's authority over them was private and intimate. And this intimacy is where gender becomes culturally charged. Violence carried out within a domestic space by a woman is read differently from violence carried out publicly by a man. Domestic violence is associated with care. It uses the tools of household life, time, routine, proximity, discipline, dependence. When such tools are turned into instruments of harm, the sense of betrayal is intensified. A male landowner punishing serfs can be absorbed into the brutal normality of patriarchal estate life. A female landowner punishing serfs disrupts the expected script of feminine moral order. The disruption becomes a story. The story is not simply, a noble abused her power. It becomes, a woman became monstrous. This shift has consequences for justice. When a woman is framed as monstrous, punishment can become more symbolic. It must correct not only a crime but a cultural violation. This is one reason Saltykova's public humiliation has such prominence in retellings. It performs a restoration of gendered order. The bad woman is displayed and degraded. Society witnesses the correction. The punishment becomes an act of reassurance. Reassurance that feminine order still holds. Reassurance that the household can still be imagined as moral. Reassurance that female authority is safe when properly contained. Yet this reassurance is built on a false premise, that harm is exceptional when enacted by women and ordinary when enacted by men. In reality, harm is shaped by opportunity, impunity, and structure. Gender influences the form and interpretation, but not necessarily the underlying capacity for cruelty. This is why gender analysis must be paired with power analysis. Saltykova's case is instructive precisely because it reveals how private authority can be exercised by women in ways that mirror the broader violence of the system. The estate did not become violent because a woman controlled it. The estate was already a structure of coercion. What changed was the degree and intensity with which coercion was used. Intensity is not gendered. It is enabled. This is also why modern readers should be cautious about importing contemporary psychological explanations. There is a tendency in modern true crime to treat extreme cases as puzzles of personality, to search for childhood trauma, mental illness, or deviant sexuality as explanatory keys. In Saltykova's case, the evidence for such personal explanations is thin and often filtered through later hostile retellings. To build a psychological portrait from that material is not responsible historical method. It also distracts from what can be known with more confidence. We can know that she held legal authority over serfs. We can know that closed systems shielded that authority. We can know that petitioning was dangerous. We can know that intervention was delayed until politically useful. We can know that punishment served state legitimacy as well as moral correction. These are structural truths. The question then becomes, why is gender still so central in the retelling? Because gender is a narrative shortcut. It allows writers to explain the inexplicable by appealing to cultural anxiety, the wicked woman, the devouring mistress, the perversion of domesticity. These images are older than Saltykova and have been used repeatedly to contain women's power within moral boundaries. In this sense, the myth of Salty Chica is not only a crime story. It is a gender story that reassures society about what women are supposed to be. This reassurance has real consequences beyond literature. It shapes how institutions respond to women in positions of authority. It shapes how female perpetrators are described in courts and newspapers. It shapes how victims are believed or dismissed depending on whether the alleged offender fits cultural scripts. It also shapes how we decide what kinds of power are dangerous. If we treat female violence as anomaly, we ignore how common violence becomes under unchecked authority. If we treat Saltykova as uniquely monstrous, we fail to ask why the estate system allowed abuse to continue. Gender becomes a screen that hides the machinery. This chapter, therefore, insists on a more uncomfortable perspective. Saltykova is not interesting because she proves something about women. She is interesting because she reveals what private sovereignty looks like when it is taken seriously. A noblewoman could function, within her domain, as a ruler. She could punish. She could isolate. She could command fear. The estate granted her these capacities not despite her gender, but through a culturally acceptable route: domestic authority, moral discipline, household management. When the state punished her, it punished her as both criminal and symbol. And when culture retold her story, it retold her as monster because monster is easier than structure. Chapter 17: Private Authority as Public Risk. Saltykova's case is often treated as a grotesque outlier. It is more accurately understood as an extreme demonstration of something ordinary, the danger of private sovereignty. Private sovereignty is not a legal term of the period, but it captures the lived reality of estate power. A landowner's authority over serfs functioned like a small jurisdiction. It was supported by law, custom, and distance. It shaped daily life more immediately than imperial policy ever could. It was, for those living under it, the most consequential form of government they experienced. When such authority is insulated, abuse is not an anomaly. It is a risk built into the design. Closed systems share certain features regardless of era. They concentrate power in a small number of hands. They rely on internal reporting rather than external oversight. They punish complaint as disruption. They protect reputation by keeping harm private. They normalize adaptation to suffering rather than investigation of it. These features can be found in estates, households, institutions, workplaces, and families. They are not unique to the past. What differs is the legal framework supporting them, the language used to justify them, and the degree to which external intervention is culturally acceptable. In 18th-century Russia, The estate was perhaps one of the clearest examples of such a system because it was explicitly built on inequality enforced by law. Serfdom placed large populations under private rule. It granted landowners both economic control and disciplinary power. It treated serfs as dependents rather than as citizens. In doing so, it created a vast landscape of private authority across the empire. Most of that authority was never examined. The state did not have the administrative capacity or political desire to audit estate life routinely. It relied on nobles to manage their domains. The arrangement functioned because it was efficient for those with power. Efficiency, however, is not safety. Efficiency often means that harm is handled internally, quietly, and with minimal disruption. It means that the system prefers to absorb suffering rather than to expose it. This is where private authority becomes public risk. A public risk is not merely a risk to individuals. It is a risk to the legitimacy of the system itself. When abuse becomes visible, it threatens the state's claim to order. It creates scandal. It can provoke unrest. It can undermine the belief that hierarchy is stable and morally defensible. States therefore have an interest in preventing certain abuses from becoming visible, not necessarily by preventing them entirely, but by keeping them contained. When containment fails, the state intervenes. This is what happened in Saltykova's case. The state did not dismantle private sovereignty. It disciplined it. It punished one landowner to restore the credibility of the system that allowed landowners to rule privately. The intervention functioned as a repair. Repair does not change the structure. It reinforces it. It says, the system works, except when an individual fails. It says, the state can correct extremes, therefore the system is legitimate. It says, trust the hierarchy, because the sovereign watches. This message is persuasive because it offers both security and continuity. It reassures the public without forcing reform. Yet the case also reveals the limits of that reassurance. If the sovereign truly watched, why did the case take so long? If petitions were truly heard, why were complainants punished for years? If the system was truly orderly, why could private cruelty become so extensive? These questions expose private authority as a chronic vulnerability in any system that values non-interference. Non-interference is often framed as respect for privacy. In estates, it was framed as respect for noble rights. Privacy and rights can be genuine values. They can also become shields. Shields protect those inside. They do not necessarily protect those inside equally. In estate life, privacy protected landowners far more than it protected serfs. For serfs, privacy meant invisibility, and invisibility meant that harm could proceed without external consequence. Invisibility is one of the main ways private authority becomes dangerous. If suffering is not seen, it cannot be corrected. If complaint is not heard, it cannot change practice. If harm is treated as internal, it can repeat. The estate's internal logic is therefore crucial. Estates did not need to be fully secret to sustain abuse. They needed only to be treated as spaces where outsiders had limited right to know. This attitude persists in many contexts beyond serfdom. Families are often treated as private spaces where outsiders hesitate to intervene. Workplaces can become private hierarchies where whistleblowers are punished. Institutions can become closed worlds where residents' complaints are minimized. In each case, the same pattern emerges. Internal authority is trusted until scandal forces external intervention. Saltykova's case offers a historical example of this pattern. It shows how long a closed system can sustain harm when those harmed have limited voice. It shows how petitioning becomes the only path to outside intervention. It shows how outside intervention depends on political conditions rather than purely on moral urgency. It also shows how the punishment of one individual can be used to reassure society while leaving the underlying structure intact. This is the pattern of bad apple thinking. The system identifies a singular offender. The offender is removed. The system claims correction. The conditions enabling abuse remain. Bad apple thinking is comforting because it suggests that abuse is rare and fixable without structural change. It is also dangerous because it guarantees repetition elsewhere. Saltykova's story, then, is not only about her. It is about what societies do when confronted with the consequences of their own arrangements. They punish. They display. They contain. Then they return to normal. Normal, in this case, meant the continuation of serfdom. The state's willingness to punish Saltykova did not translate into regular oversight of estates. It did not create robust protections for serfs. It did not alter the basic relationship between landowner and laborer. The private sovereignty of the estate remained. The public risk remained as well. It remained in the form of routine cruelty unpunished. It remained in the form of silenced complaint. It remained in the form of harm that would only become visible when politically useful to address. Saltykova's case is therefore both extraordinary and representative. Extraordinary in intensity, duration, and notoriety. Representative in the structural conditions that allowed it to persist. This duality is what gives the case its lasting value as historical examination rather than merely as horror story. Chapter 18: What this case explains, and what it does not. The temptation, at the end of a case like Darya Saltykova's, is to seek resolution. To decide what she was, to extract a moral, to close the story neatly. History rarely allows that kind of certainty, and when it does, it is usually because complexity has been forced into a simpler shape than it deserves. This book has resisted that impulse deliberately. Saltykova's case explains many things. It also refuses to explain others. It explains how private authority can become lethal when insulated from oversight. It explains how legal systems that rely on hierarchy and discretion tend to protect those at the top. It explains how suffering can persist for years when those who endure it are legally dependent, socially marginal, and structurally silenced. It explains how intervention often arrives not when harm is greatest, but when harm becomes politically useful to address. It does not explain Saltykova's inner life. The historical record does not permit confident claims about her psychology, motivations, or emotional reasoning. Later writers have supplied such claims freely, often with great certainty, but certainty without evidence is not explanation. It is narrative satisfaction. This book has avoided constructing an interior portrait not because Saltykova's interiority is unimportant, but because it is inaccessible. To invent it would be to substitute modern imagination for historical method. What can be said is this: she exercised power in ways that were permitted, protected, and prolonged by the system in which she lived. Whether her cruelty exceeded that of others matters less, historically, than the fact that it could exceed for so long without interruption. This is the book's central claim. The most disturbing element of Saltykova's story is not her singular brutality. It is the comfort with which that brutality was housed within ordinary arrangements of authority. The estate was not an aberration. It was a standard unit of governance. Serfdom was not a breakdown of law. It was law. Private punishment was not forbidden. It was regulated loosely and rarely enforced. Within this framework, harm did not require secrecy to survive. It required only silence, delay, and the absence of inconvenience to those with power. Saltykova's case also explains why punishment often fails to produce reform. When the state intervened, it did so decisively, but narrowly. The intervention punished an individual, not a system. It restored legitimacy without restructuring authority. It demonstrated control while preserving the conditions that had made abuse possible. This pattern repeats across history. Institutions respond to scandal by isolating offenders. They reassure the public by emphasizing exceptionality. They preserve structures by treating harm as deviation rather than design. Saltykova's life imprisonment achieved exactly this outcome. It removed a source of scandal. It produced a cautionary symbol. It allowed the state to claim moral action. It did not challenge serfdom's private sovereignty. This does not mean the intervention was meaningless. For those directly harmed, removal mattered. Relief matters. Survival matters. But relief is not justice in a systemic sense. The case also explains why female perpetrators are remembered differently. Saltykova became a monster in cultural memory because monstrosity simplifies. It allows society to condemn without reflection. It allows gender norms to be restored by identifying a woman who violated them. It allows the deeper question, why a woman could wield such power unchecked, to be avoided. Monster stories reassure. System stories implicate. This book has chosen the latter. It has treated Saltykova not as an isolated pathology, but as a figure whose actions illuminate the risks inherent in private authority. Her gender matters, but not in the way sensational retellings suggest. It matters because it shaped how her power was exercised, how her violence was interpreted, and how her punishment was staged. It does not explain the violence on its own. What the case does not explain is how often similar harm occurred elsewhere. We cannot extrapolate precise frequency from one extreme case. The archive does not allow us to count the uncounted. We cannot know how many estates operated under comparable brutality, or how many deaths were absorbed quietly into routine. The absence of record is not proof of absence. It is proof of invisibility. This invisibility is itself part of the story. The people who suffered under Saltykova did not leave memoirs. They left traces in petitions, testimonies, and rumors filtered through hostile systems. Their lives appear in the record when harm becomes inconvenient to ignore, and even then only partially. This book has not attempted to reconstruct them fully, because the archive does not permit it. To pretend otherwise would be another form of erasure. What can be said is that their suffering was not accidental. It was produced by a system that valued land, labor, and hierarchy above individual life. This is the final discomfort the case offers. It asks readers to recognize that the problem is not simply that some people abuse power. The problem is that societies repeatedly create arrangements in which abuse is easy, complaint is dangerous, and intervention is optional. Saltykova's story belongs to the 18th century. Its structure does not. Private authority continues to exist in many forms. Households, institutions, workplaces, and informal hierarchies still rely on trust without oversight. When harm occurs within them, the first response is often silence, then disbelief, then delay. Intervention arrives late, if at all, and often focuses on removing individuals rather than examining structures. This is why historical true crime matters when it is written with restraint. It is not an exercise in horror. It is an examination of governance at its most intimate level. It shows how ordinary arrangements can become dangerous when power is insulated and those beneath are treated as expendable. This book does not ask readers to marvel at cruelty. It asks them to notice how cruelty is made possible. Darya Saltykova was punished. The estate system endured. The danger lay, and still lies, not only in those who abuse power, but in the confidence that power will regulate itself if left alone. That confidence has never been justified by history. And that is where this story ends. Bibliography. Primary sources and published primary material. Catherine II. The Grand Instructions, Nakaz, to the commissioners appointed to frame a new code of laws for the Russian Empire. Imperial-era legal and administrative records relating to petitions, investigations, and sentencing in 18th-century Russia. Contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles/compiled document collections on Catherine II's reign and governance. Scholarship on petitions, law, and administrative practice. Smith. To each their grievance is bitter and unbearable, petitions, autocracy, and the rule of law in 18th-century Russia. Law and History Review. De Madariaga, Isabel. Catherine II and the Serfs, a reconsideration of some problems. The Slavonic and East European Review, JSTOR. Scholarship on Serfdom and Catherine II's political context. De Madariaga, Isabel. Russia in the Age of Catherine the Great. Edited scholarly volume, Springer chapter. The Question of Serfdom, Catherine II, The Russian Debate.